Chapter 692. On the hill in the night, the faint silver moon swam in and out of the clouds, making the place flicker between bright and dark. Jinggu stared at the lonely carriage on the road at the foot of the mountain. A moment later, an angry snort came out of his silver mask. The black and incomparably sturdy spear hung beside his warhorse. His hands were not the only ones on the horse's reins. Ever since the rebellion in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qin calendar, the Qin family had been destroyed. In front of the tens of thousands of people in the royal palace, the silver-masked Jinggu who had challenged Qin Heng had become a legendary figure. In particular, during these 3 years, Chen Pingping had purposely given up power to cultivate the new power of the Overwatch Council. In order to smoothly hand over this council to Fan Xian, as Fan Xian's trusted aide, Jinggu had taken over the position of commander of the Black Knights of the 5th Bureau. In the instant the old man in the wheelchair at the foot of the mountain had been carried into the carriage, a glimmer of despair and anger rose in Jing Ji's heart. Squeezing his horse's belly, he prepared to lead his Black Knights to charge down and snatch the person. He could not just watch as Director Chen stepped onto the road to certain death on his way back to the capital. Back then, he had been bullied and humiliated in the army camp. During a routine drill, he had howled and attacked in self-defense. Unexpectedly, he had killed the eldest son of the Qin family. From that day on, he had been thrown into the Qin kingdom's death prison. The family and wife he had left behind in his hometown had all been secretly killed by the Qin family in revenge. He was already a dead man, but unexpectedly, Chen Pingping secretly saved him and arranged for him to be part of the Shadow Knights. He wore a silver mask to hide his true appearance. For the sake of revenge, for the sake of repaying the debt of gratitude, he had been promoted to the position of deputy commander in the Shadow Knights. Fan Xian had given him a chance for revenge, so he was very grateful to Fan Xian. However, he knew that it was Chen Pingping who had given him a second life. In his heart, the silver-masked Jinggu saw Director Chen as a second parent. On the mountain, Chen Pingping's wheelchair got into the carriage. A murderous intent surged in his heart, and he was about to rush down when the bald man beside him coldly pulled on the reins. Jinggu looked back angrily. His eyes, as deep as the netherworld, stared at the baldy through the holes in the silver mask. However, he did not attack because this baldy had more seniority in the Overwatch Council than him and had once held a more important position. This baldy was the previous head of the 7th Bureau that Fan Xian had met in the Overwatch Council prison. The director has said that your mission is to take these 4,000 Black Knights and escort the carriages out of the country. Then, you must ensure that these 4,000 Black Knights are all handed over to Sir Fan Jr.'s hands without a single exception. The bald man's face appeared particularly old and tired. In the depths of his heart, he was just like Jinggu, filled with sorrow and anger. However, he was Chen Pingping's most trusted old official. He had appeared among the Black Knights today on the old director's orders to suppress any possible unrest in the Black Knights. Do you know that if the director returns to the capital, he will never be able to come out again? Jinggu looked at him coldly and slowly asked, enunciating each word. This is the director's will. Everything I have done is done in accordance with his will. The bald leader's expression was calm. He did not retreat a single step. Jinggu stared in a daze at the road. He then saw Chen Pingping at the carriage door, looking back at him with a sharp gaze. His body trembled. He slowly raised his right hand and formed it into a fist, restraining the violent emotions in the hearts of his subordinates. After a long time, Jinggu watched the black carriages slowly embark on the road back to the capital while being surrounded or escorted by 3,000 elite riders of the Jingdo garrison. Jinggu took a deep breath and slowly took off the silver mask on his face, revealing the terrifying and wretched wound. He didn't speak for a long time. He bid farewell to Chen Pingping. He knew that he would probably never see the old director again. The usually cold Jing Ji's eyes became slightly moist. The bald leader continued to stare in that direction in silence. There was a slight smile on his face, but a joyous desire to die gradually rose in his eyes. The bald leader dismounted from his horse and knelt down toward the quiet road. Very respectfully, he kowtowed. Jingu looked at his expression and felt slightly shocked. He knew that once this elder completed his task of watching him leave the country, he would probably leave with Director Chen. His heart felt slightly sorrowful, but he didn't say anything. He only looked at him calmly. He then dismounted from his horse and kowtowed in that direction. All of the Black Knights dismounted at the same time and knelt down densely on the small hill. They kowtowed toward the road that no longer had people or carriages and bid farewell to Director Chen. A moment later, Jingu carefully put on the silver mask on his face. In a raspy voice, he gave the order, "Retreat. Head east." These 4,000 Black Knights were the Overwatch Council's most powerful and reliable martial power. Regardless of how the Emperor wanted to deal with Chen Pingping or what methods the court would think of to weaken the Overwatch Council to offset any possible backlash from Chen Pingping, the Black Knights would always be the most important in the eyes of the court. The Black Knights searched for mountain paths around the official roads and advanced like ghosts. Under the bald head's cold gaze, the silver-masked Jingu could only give up on the idea of sending soldiers forward to slaughter the Jingo garrison riders and take back the old director. On the carriages they were protecting, the officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council had even deeper thoughts. Wang Qinyan's disguised face was not only stiff, it also seemed to have aged. He glanced at Gao De beside him, covered in blood. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "The director returned to the capital, only to seek death." Gao De was still in a semi-conscious state, and the mute woman could not speak. She looked at the man in astonishment, not knowing who he was talking to. Outside the slowly advancing carriage, someone suddenly sighed. A normal-looking Overwatch Council official pushed open the carriage door and walked in. Sitting across from Wang Qinyan, he said after a moment of silence, "Everyone knows, but no one can stop it. You should know that the director is doing this for the benefit of the council. He doesn't want the Qin kingdom to be shaken. He also doesn't want the duke to be involved. Zhongzhui, you've been following me. Are you afraid I'll go inform Sir Fan Jr.?" Wang Qinyan had no intention of joking. He only looked coldly at his companion across from him and said each word clearly, "If the director dies, it would be impossible for Sir Fan Jr. not to get involved. Since it is so, why not make this move earlier? In this world, the only person who can stop what happens in Jingdo is him." Sitting across from him was Zhongzhui. He and Wang Qinyan were known as the two wings of the Overwatch Council. Traveling thousands of li and tracking, he was one of the two most powerful people in the world. He looked at Wang Qinyan and calmly said, "Before the director left, he gave you strict orders to not inform Sir Fan Jr." Wang Qinyan suddenly furrowed his brows and said, "I heard that Sir Fan Jr. has already left Dongyi." Along the way, he was chased by a number of Dongyi rebel soldiers. How did those Dongyi rebel soldiers know the Overwatch Council's return route? Zhongzhui didn't reply. Wang Qinyan stared at him and said, "It was the old director who spread the news. He wanted to stop Fan Xian from returning to the capital early. He wanted to end all of this before Fan Xian returned." Zhongzhui silently agreed to this point. Wang Qinyan slowly lowered his head and said, "It will take some time for Dazhou to return to the capital. If I leave the carriages now and rush to the east of Yanjing to inform Sir Fan Jr., he should still have time to return to Jingdo." A complicated emotion suddenly rose in Zhongzhui's eyes. "All these years, I've been following the old director. You've been following Sir Fan Jr. The mission the director gave me was to keep an eye on you." He sighed. "The director is correct. Those who follow Sir Fan Jr. for a long time become different from us. They become overly impulsive and don't think about the results. Then," he said seriously, "I must carry out the director's orders. I cannot let you drag Sir Fan Jr. into this. You can stop me?" Wang Qinyan stared at him and asked. "The two of us have never had a clear winner, even when you were a civil servant a few years ago. A strange smile rose to Zhong Zhui's face. Immediately after, his smile froze on his face because the hilt of a knife had silently touched his waist, causing half of his body to go numb. Immediately after, Wang Qinyan's palm turned into a knife and viciously chopped down on the back of his neck. He didn't even make a grunt before he fell onto the wooden planks of the carriage. The mute woman hugged her child and looked at this scene with a face full of shock. She was speechless. Holding the knife tightly, Gauda opened his eyes and breathed with great difficulty. He then said to Wang Qinian, "Let's go." Wang Qinian glanced at him and slowly nodded his head. Sir Fan Jr. said that living is the most important. I think he is also willing to let the old director live. Gauda coughed and coughed up blood. In a raspy voice, he said, "Time, nonsense." Wang Qinian gave an ugly smile. Turning around, he pushed aside the curtain of the black carriage and swept out like a gust of wind. The night was dark and heavy. The only person in the world who could catch up to him, Zhong Zhui, was unconscious in the carriage. He was going to notify Fan Xian. Presumably, no one would be able to stop him. However, he didn't know if he would make it in time. When Fan Xian learned of everything that had happened in Jingdo and Dazhou and rushed back, would Chen Pingping still be able to sit safely in his wheelchair? The night was as cold as water and as black as ink. Mixing together, it was like ink in water, transforming into countless shapes of wind and sand that were difficult to grasp. A number of days later, the riders of the Jingdo garrison finally rushed back to the outskirts of Jingdo. Because there was a black carriage that could not move very fast, the entire speed was suppressed to a very slow pace. However, no one had any objections. They even felt that the slower they went, the better. The commander of the garrison, Xiaofan, had been sitting in the carriage with Chen Pingping like a filial junior. He served Chen Pingping's food and water, daily life, and rest. Usually, he chatted with him about the Qin kingdom's past and future, the funny political stories in court, or the elusive rumors in the palace. It was truly like an old official had been taken back to Jingdo by his successor to retire. However, everyone knew that was not the truth. It was already autumn. When the Jingdo garrison, who had invited Chen Pingping back, rushed back to Jingdo, they purposely chose the darkest hour before dawn. There was a sliver of white on the eastern horizon, but it was not very bright. It was unable to display the clear autumn sky of Jingdo in front of everyone's eyes. Everyone could only smell the extremely light air, so light that there was a thread of dryness, moving back and forth between their mouths and noses. Other than the dozen or so injured, the rest of the 3,600 riders surrounded the black carriage and arrived outside Jingdo's Jingyang Gate. Presumably, along the way, Xiaofan had already reported the situation in Dazhou to the Bureau of Military Affairs or Internal Court in Jingdo through top-secret channels. Thus, when the densely packed riders arrived in front of Jingdo's gates in the dark, the soldiers of the 13 city gate guards at the eastern gate were not shocked at all. They also did not raise any alarm signals that they should not have. It was quiet above and below the city walls. In the darkness, one could occasionally hear the sound of horses' hooves kicking. The patch of whiteness in the east only shone on the tall walls of Jingdo, making the topmost layer of black bricks give off a somber sound. The bird that had risen the hardest in the morning flew quickly in front of the city walls and let out a joyful cry. A heavy creak rang out. For once, the Jingdo city gates opened before the hour was up. Under the effect of the mechanism, the heavy city gates opened up a path that could allow a carriage to pass through. It was pitch black. It was impossible to see clearly what dangers were hidden inside. The soldiers of the 13 city gate guards stood on the city walls and looked warily and curiously at the city gate. They didn't know what had happened. Why was it that from their immediate superior to the strange appearance of the Jingdo garrison soldiers outside, it was as if they were facing a great enemy? All of the handover work was completed in a frightening silence. Under the control of the old servant, the black carriage slowly entered Jingdo's city gates. Until now, this carriage was still under the control of the old servant of the Overwatch Council. This carriage was still under the control of the old cripple in the carriage. None of the important military officials inside and outside the city dared to forcefully take the position of the driver of the carriage. No one lifted the curtain to verify the identity of the old man inside. Xiaofan silently watched the carriage enter Jingyang Gate and then slowly close the city gates. He knew his mission had finally been completed. Before he left, he had thought that the Jingdo garrison would have to sacrifice countless lives to complete his mission. Yet, he had done it so easily. There was nothing else for him to do. Regardless of the emperor's anger at him not being able to completely complete his mission, Xiaofan did not care. He only stared in a daze at the tightly closed heavy city gates. Countless complicated emotions rose in his heart. The civil officials of the Qin court all felt disgust toward the Overwatch Council and the old cripple in the Overwatch Council other than fear. They thought that the old cripple was the emperor's old black dog, a terrifying fellow who bit everyone he met. In the eyes of the major military figures, the Overwatch Council was their most loyal, reliable, and powerful partner. Although they also had boundless fear of Chen Pingping, Xiaofan suddenly felt that this old man, who would rather return to the capital alone than have the Overwatch Council and the military fight a great battle, was worthy of his respect. He was silent for a long time. He then slowly waved his hand and led the 3,000 Jingdo garrison soldiers, who all had complicated emotions and had escaped the joy of their lives, slowly away from the heavy city walls and the man-eating city gates. The black horse carriage slowly entered Jingyang Gate and the heavy gate slowly closed. A few people slowly approached the carriage. It was currently the darkest time before dawn and the light was extremely dim. It was impossible to clearly see the faces of those people. The people in charge of waiting outside Jingyang Gate were all top figures in the Qin court. One was eunuch Yao, who had been sent by the palace. Another was the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, Yi Zhong, who controlled the armies of the world. The last was the traveling scholar of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, He Zhongwei. The three of them approached the black carriage. For a moment, no one spoke. In the end, it was Yi Zhong who spoke. He gazed at the carriage and said in an even voice, "Director, it has been hard on you to return." Eunuch Yao calmly said, "Director, please follow me into the palace to see the emperor." He Zhongwei stood to the side and didn't speak. His face was calm. He maintained the silence he should maintain at this moment. There was silence in the carriage. After a long time, the old man slowly sighed and warmly said, "A lonely old man returning to the capital has disturbed your peace. I am truly apologetic." The carriage slowly moved. Under the collective escort of internal court eunuchs and military aces, it moved along the street under Jingyang Gate toward the royal palace in the center of Jingdo. It seemed that the Overwatch Council in Jingdo did not know that their ancestor had already returned to Jingdo and was about to face the emperor's towering anger. Even the officials in court and the Jingdo people with sharp senses did not know of this. It was a dark dawn. The trees on both sides of the street under Jingyang Gate were like countless boats swaying in the cool autumn wind. The street led directly to the royal palace. There were no pedestrians on either side. Presumably, it had long been purged and was under the highest level of martial law. It was empty and desolate. Only the black horse carriage was moving forward. It was moving forward in a lonely manner. It traveled until it reached the front of the brilliant royal palace. Coincidentally, the sun finally broke free of the restraints of the earth and leaped out, illuminating the royal palace. The fire-like warm golden light just happened to envelop the black carriage. Chapter 693. A few files of varying thickness lay quietly on the table in the royal study. In these short days, they had been flipped through countless times by that pair of steady eyes. Then, as if they had been forgotten, they were placed there with unusual silence. Time was not enough for dust to cover these files. However, the cool air of early autumn made the pages of these files curl up like they had been roasted by fire. That pair of deep and scorching eyes slowly moved away from the scroll, cast outside into the dim and dazzling light of the palace before dawn. The light from the east had already illuminated the highest brick on the walls of Jingdo, but it was still unable to shine into the royal palace, which was deeply locked in darkness by the city walls and palace walls. The Qing emperor expressionlessly picked up the teacup by his hand and took a sip. The tea was cold. The eunuchs who usually served by his side did not have the courage to come in and change it to hot as usual. An entire night had passed, and all he drank was cold tea. Like a fish drinking water, only one knew if it was warm or cold. When the cold tea entered his chest and stomach, it turned into a burning stream of heat. Was it anger that was difficult to suppress? Was it the pain of being deceived by someone he trusted? Or was it a sense of humiliation that he had never felt before? That old dog had hidden it from him for decades. The angrier he got, the calmer he became. The Qing emperor was no longer as angry as he had been a few days ago. His expression and gaze were as calm as two pools of ice water, extremely cold and calm. It was not like an ancient well. It was like water that was about to turn to ice, blindly cold. This coldness spread around the royal study, making everyone who stopped outside feel a fear that came from the depths of their hearts. A familiar sound faintly rang out in the distance. It was the sound of a wheelchair rolling over the stone tiles of the royal palace. The special round chair and the cracks between the stone tiles rubbed endlessly. The width of the stone tiles was fixed, and the distance between the wheelchair and the stone tiles was fixed. Thus, the rhythm and timing of the sound of the wheelchair rolling over the stone tiles were also fixed. This kind of fixed rhythm had rung out countless times in the quiet royal palace during these decades. Each time the Qing emperor had something important to do or just wanted to talk, the sound of the wheelchair would travel from outside the palace into the palace, all the way into the royal study. In recent years, the sound of the wheelchair has lessened. That old black dog hides in the Qin garden to enjoy his life, leaving me alone in this cold palace to suffer. However, 3 years ago, when he had to deal with Yunrui and those 3 strange creatures, the wheelchair had entered the palace twice. The Qing emperor's expression was indifferent. In an instant, he thought of many past events. He then slowly raised his head. When his calm and deep gaze landed on the tightly shut wooden door of the imperial study, the sound of the wheelchair rubbing against the stone floor stopped in the imperial study. The emperor's gaze suddenly became complicated. Eunuch Yao's trembling voice rang out in the royal study. It was not that the head of the eunuchs had purposely used such a terrified voice to express the importance he attached to the figure in the wheelchair. Inside and outside the royal study, the coldness that the Qing emperor naturally gave off with his great-Grand Master realm had already controlled the hearts of most people. The door to the royal study opened. A few eunuchs carefully and fearfully carried the black wheelchair in. Then, led by Eunuch Yao, they left as quickly as they could. This group of internal court eunuchs left the royal study very, very far away. They walked all the way to where the royal study went around the stone-arched garden gate and led directly to Taiji Palace. Eunuch Yao wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and glanced at Commander Yi and Scholar He waiting outside the garden gate. He didn't say anything. There wasn't even a hint of expression. Yi Zhong's expression was heavy. He only sighed in his heart. After these top figures of the Qing kingdom escorted the black carriage into the royal study, they all consciously hid far away. They knew that under the emperor's cold envelopment, he would not want anyone to hear every word he said to the person in the wheelchair. Old Director Chen returned safely and gently. Although they were not used to such an easy resolution, although they knew old Director Chen was not a simple and terrifying person, including Yi Chong and Eunuch Yao, they were not worried that anything alarming would happen in the royal study. The emperor was a great Grand Master. After Dong Mountain, no one in the world would be able to harm him. The royal study's doors were tightly shut, cutting off all the air, sound, light, smell, and autumn outside. Only the emperor, who was sitting ramrod straight on the couch, and Chen Pingping, who was casually sitting in a wheelchair, remained. The two of them hid in the little building, cutting off the storms of the Qing kingdom outside. The storms of the Qing kingdom these decades had been stirred up by these two powerful people. The Qing emperor looked calmly at the old man in the wheelchair for an indeterminable amount of time. It was only when the wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face were like chrysanthemums under the hanging temple that he faintly said, "He Zhongwei is secretly investigating Gouda and wants to defeat Fan Xian. I knew of this long ago. The internal court sent 3 people over. When you passed by Dazhou a few days ago, He Qigan should have been there. Did you see him? If there was someone else present and saw this scene, they would certainly be shocked." The emperor had mobilized so many people. All of the important yamens in Jingdou were on standby. The icy young master of the Overwatch Council had also begun to carry out the emperor's edict and began internal pressure. Only then did he manage to invite the old cripple in the black wheelchair back to Jingdou. Everyone knew that there was no turning point between the ruler and his official. However, the emperor's first words to Chen Pingping were an unremarkable name. Chen Pingping was not surprised. He understood his emperor too well. He smiled slightly and said in a slightly sharp and raspy voice, "When I was sent to King Cheng's manor, He Qigan was still young. I saw him once outside Dazhou. Presumably, he doesn't remember me at all. That's not strange. The name Chen Wuchang has disappeared from the royal palace for a long time." The emperor nodded. The sleeve of his dragon robe flew up. A cup of tea slowly left the table and flew in front of Chen Pingping. Chen Pingping accepted it and respectfully nodded his head in greeting. Holding the scalding hot teacup, he sighed comfortably and said, "It's best to drink tea hot." The emperor used his fingers to pick up his icy cold teacup and took a small sip. Calmly, he said, "When people leave, the tea gets cold. Otherwise, how could He Qigan not recognize you?" Chen Pingping shook his head and said, "Other than Hong Xixiang, not many people knew that I had once stayed in the palace." The emperor's eyelids lowered slightly and revealed a glimmer of mockery. "Later, you even made a fake beard and stuck it to your chin. Of course, you didn't want others to know that you were a eunuch." Chen Pingping's expression did not change. He lowered his head slightly and lightly said, "It was only many years later that I understood that I had always been a eunuch. There was no need to hide it from the world. But, in the end, you still managed to hide it from the world." The emperor placed the cold teacup on the table and stared into Chen Pingping's eyes. "Back then, you were sent to the manor by the palace to monitor father's movements. However, not even the palace thought that you would secretly reveal your identity to me and be willing to help my manor rise up. In the end, even old eunuch Hong in the palace was persuaded by you to stand on father's side. That was all because of you. Thus, the identity of a permanent eunuch in the palace back then was a great service to you, me, and the Qing kingdom. Why do you always keep this matter in mind? The reason the previous emperor was able to ascend to the throne had little to do with me." Chen Pingping called himself a servant. Unlike in the past, there was not much sense of inferiority in this servant. He only followed the past and said it naturally. He slowly raised his head and looked directly into the Qing emperor's cold eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "That was because someone killed 2 princes. That was why it was King Cheng's turn to sit on the throne and why it was possible for your majesty to have the vast territory you have today." The emperor's gaze suddenly became sharp. It was clear that he did not want to hear anything related to this matter. "But, why did you betray the nobles in the palace and throw yourself into the manor to be loyal to me?" he asked. Chen Pingping gazed at the Qing emperor with a not quite there smile like he was looking at a great joke. After a long time, he slowly said, "Your Majesty, at that time, you were still a young man. Your nature was clear and broad. You treated people sincerely and your subordinates well. However, I was born with a strange personality. As long as someone treated me well, I would treat them well." The emperor fell silent. He sat ramrod straight on the soft couch as if he was still savoring Chen Pingping's words. His sharp gaze became like the long day at the beginning of autumn. Gradually, he revealed his cool side. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. Mockingly, he said, "So, you still know that I treated you well." Back then, the old prince didn't have any status in the court and didn't have any support in the court. Prince Cheng's manor wasn't big and unremarkable. I was actually the most useless little eunuch in the palace, so I was sent to the prince's manor. For someone as powerful as Hong Xiang, of course, he was always at the side of the nobles in the palace. Chen Pingping seemed to be thinking of many things of the past. He slowly sighed and said, "However, being small has its advantages. Simple has its advantages." At that time, there were 3 big boys and 1 little boy. They did their best. Mother Fan would occasionally yell at them from the side, but no one seemed to think it was bad. At that time, King Jing was still young. No one wanted to pay attention to him. The emperor raised an eyebrow and said, "Even if Fan Jian and him joined forces to attack me, in the end, they were still stopped by you. When the 2 of us join forces, no one has ever been a match for us. It is still the same today." After these words left his mouth, Chen Pingping and the emperor fell silent at the same time. After a long time, Chen Pingping gently touched the armrest of the wheelchair and sighed. "After all, Fan Jian was your Majesty's milk brother. In the end, I am only a servant. At the time, I didn't think much. I just wanted to protect you." The lines of the Qing emperor's face gradually softened, but his gaze drifted into the distance. It was as if it had drifted to the scene of ruler and official holding hands without any disloyalty. Faintly, he said, "I have to admit, during those years, you protected me many times. If it wasn't for you, I don't know how many times I would have died." After saying that, the corner of his eye suddenly caught a glimpse of the dossiers on the table. His eyes paused for a moment, and he gently took out the first one. He slowly opened it and read through the contents of the dossiers, including his sister, his son, and many, many other things. At the beginning of the Qing kingdom's expansion, it did not disturb the Wei kingdom's iron riders, so you and I were both careless and spied on the Qin kingdom, which is now Yanjing's defenses. We were surrounded at Ding Mountain by Zhang Qingfeng's foremost killing general, Hu Yu. That person's archery skills were very good. The Qing emperor sighed. After all these years, the only person better than Hu Yu's archery skills is Xiaoyi. When he spoke of northern governor Yan Xiaoyi, who had once betrayed him, there was not a glimmer of hatred or anger in the Qing emperor's tone. There was only pity. The Qing emperor was a person who cherished talent and was extremely confident. He did not fear Yan Xiaoyi at all, which was why he showed such emotions. However, looking at the arrangements he had made for the Overwatch Council these days, in his heart, Chen Pingping was a person who far surpassed any other official. He turned his head and looked at Chen Pingping in the wheelchair. "That day, if you had not sacrificed yourself to block Hu Yu's arrow, perhaps I would have died on the spot." Chen Pingping calmly replied, "This is my duty as a servant." The Qing emperor smiled self-mockingly and glanced at the file in his hand. On it was written that during the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, Chen Pingping had secretly allowed the eldest princess to lead troops into Jingdo and successfully besiege the royal palace. Although the Overwatch Council's actions were meticulous and there was not much evidence on this file, given the emperor's eyesight, he could clearly see the great evil hidden within. He casually tossed the file to the side and ignored it. Then, he picked up another one. He squinted his eyes and read it again. He said, "At the floating temple, why did you want to have the shadow assassinate you?" Earlier, it had been a gentle wind and drizzling rain reminiscing about the past. Now, an accusatory voice suddenly rang out in the royal study. A faint stench of blood gradually filled the air. However, Chen Pingping seemed to know nothing. Respectfully, he replied, "I wanted to see just what your Majesty's final trump card was." "You wanted to see my trump card?" The emperor's gaze stared at the wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face. After a long silence, he calmly said, looks like wanting me to die is something you've thought about for a long time. Chen Pingping did not open his mouth to reply. He only smiled warmly and silently admitted to this great crime. Is the shadow really Sigujian's younger brother? The Qing emperor asked. Your Majesty's gaze is divine. That day, you guessed the shadow's true background in one gulp. I truly admire you. Chen Pingping said he admired him, but he didn't know if he truly admired him in his heart. The Qing emperor closed his eyes and thought for a bit. He then tossed the file to the side and said, during the first northern expedition, just as I was breaking through, I suddenly went berserk and was trapped by Zhang Qingfeng's army in the mountains. I was already at the end of my rope. If you had not led the Black Knights and risked your life to save me and exchanged your body for mine along the way, I would probably have died 8 or 10 times over. Chen Pingping's gaze followed the Qing emperor's hand movements. He watched as he tossed the file regarding the truth of the Hanging Temple assassination to the side. The smile in his eyes grew larger and larger until it withered. It was incomparably lonely. There was also a glimmer of mockery in the loneliness. Your Majesty, don't keep calculating like this. To use the merit of saving the emperor in exchange for a great crime of deceiving or assassinating the emperor, regardless of whether it is from the perspective of Qing law or council regulations, I have taken a great advantage. Chen Pingping's expression calmed. He looked at the emperor and coldly said, during these decades, I cannot remember how many times I have saved your Majesty. I have never had the extravagant hope of using these merits to offset my own death sentence. Using a great merit to exchange for a great crime. Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes and said lightly and mockingly, that was the little eunuch in the story she once told. However, I am not that little eunuch. Your Majesty is also not that foreign emperor. Why waste so much time? You think I am wasting time? The emperor's voice became icy, but his gaze burned. He stared at Chen Pingping like he was staring at a dead person. In the hearts of the people, you are an old black dog at my side. After raising a dog for a long time, one also has feelings. Of course, your Majesty has feelings for me. These years, the honor and power you have given me is no longer something a normal official can enjoy. Chen Pingping leaned slightly against the wheelchair and gazed coldly back at the emperor. Enunciating each word, he said, however, for you to say such things at this time, it is probably because you want to find a good reason for killing a dog to comfort your own feelings. Did you not deserve to be killed? The Qing emperor's anger made him laugh. He threw his head back and laughed loudly. The laughter passed out of the royal study and charged straight into the silent royal palace. There was a rare anger in the laughter. He turned and grabbed the files on the table and threw them fiercely at Chen Pingping. The files of different thickness landed on Chen Pingping's body and the wheelchair, making slapping sounds. The Qing emperor's gaze became very deep and cold. He stared at Chen Pingping's face and said each word clearly, you want to kill me, and you also want to kill my son. How despicable of you to force me to kill my own son. Do you, a shameless eunuch, not deserve to be killed? Chen Pingping slowly brushed away the pages on his body with a slight smile and a glimmer of pleasure as he admired the rare loss of composure the most powerful ruler in the world had in his life. This was probably one of his greatest wishes on this trip back to the capital. The dark desire for revenge that had been entangled at the bottom of his heart for decades, as well as the indescribable disappointment and sadness towards His Majesty, gathered together, causing the old cripple's state of mind to become so complicated. Your Majesty, if you didn't want to kill your own son, how could I force you to do these things? Chen Pingping looked at the emperor and faintly said. When all is said and done, I only want to kill your Majesty. As for the people of the Li royal family in the palace, I only want them to accompany you in death. The emperor calmed down and became cold. He shook off his rare anger. A supreme being in the mortal world, a great grandmaster of martial arts, had revealed such a mortal side in front of Chen Pingping. It could only be said that the decades of interaction and trust between ruler and official had long become a spiritual need that the Qing emperor could not shake off. This spiritual need suddenly became an illusion in an instant. Furthermore, behind the illusion hid the poison of betrayal. Even he found it difficult to endure the impact of such emotions. He looked coldly at Chen Pingping and said, "What I am most angry about is not that you want to kill me or all of my sons. What I am most angry about is that since you have already left Jingdo, why did you still come back? Even in such a situation, I still left you a way out. As long as you are willing to leave, I will not keep you." The emperor looked at him coldly. His deep eyes were like an angry old man from ancient times. There was boundless power in the calmness. "If I really wanted to kill you in one move, I would do it myself. I would not have those useless soldiers do this work. However, why did you come back? Why must you force me to personally kill you?" This was a wondrous and strange sentence. The major figures outside the royal study, including General Xiaofan, who had already returned to the garrison camp, could not guess the emperor's intentions. They did not know that the so-called change in Dazhou was still a test of the emperor and Chen Pingping's intentions regarding the last bit of trust between the emperor and Chen Pingping, the ruler and official. In the entire world, probably only Chen Pingping could understand. If he had left with the Black Knights in Dingzhou, it meant that he felt guilty toward the emperor and was unable to face him. However, he did not leave. He returned to Jingdo and gazed coldly and fearlessly at the emperor's face. His heart was open and clear of guilt as he forced the emperor to kill the most loyal official in the history of the Qing kingdom. After a long time, Chen Pingping's eyes were like knives as he stared at the emperor and asked, "Back then, did you give her any way out?" "I returned to the capital to ask the emperor one thing. Why did you kill her?" Chapter 694. The sky was gray, and the palace was dark. Not long after the sun rose above the horizon, it did not have time to spread its warm light over the land of the Qing kingdom. It had already been swallowed up by a dark cloud that had appeared out of nowhere. The red light immediately dimmed, and the sky grew darker. In the rear palace, serving girls who had woken up to wash in the morning began to boil water. The eunuchs who did chores began to sweep the dust off the ground with bamboo brooms taller than themselves. No one knew what was happening in the front of the royal palace. Like the common people, they repeated their missions and lives day after day. The nobles were no exception. Although the strange situation in Jingdo had faintly entered their ears, the matter was limited to a very limited number of people in the Qing kingdom. Thus, no one knew what had happened. At the gate of the garden, the important figures gazing at the royal study from afar were naturally one of the people who knew about this matter. However, their eyes were sunken and their expressions were solemn. They were as wooden as clay statues and did not react at all. Old Director Chen had been in the royal study for a long time, but there was still no movement. Because everyone was far away, they did not hear the emperor's rare angry roar. Perhaps Yi Zhong and Eunuch Yao had this kind of power, but they would not be stupid enough to gather their power and eavesdrop on the sounds in the royal study. As for those things, it would be better if they could hear as little as possible. Chen Pingping wanted to hear a reason and an explanation. Thus, he returned to Jingdo and sat coldly in the black wheelchair. Calmly, he looked at the master he had served for decades, the Qing emperor. He wanted to hear from his mouth exactly what had happened in the past. When a person was about to die, what they clung to was nothing more than the most infuriating and inexplicable mysteries of their lives. However, the Qing emperor did not reply. He only looked calmly at Chen Pingping. Ever since he heard Chen Pingping's words, he had maintained his standing posture. He looked at him coldly and mockingly for a long time. The sharp light in his eyes gradually turned into a faint mockery, as well as a great deal of confusion. The corners of his eyes narrowed slightly, like a lion watching a wandering spirit pass by its own kingdom, trying to pull up the branches of a solid tree in vain to announce something to itself. The Qing emperor smiled strangely. Tilting his head slightly, he pressed his lips together tightly. Looking at Chen Pingping, he said faintly, "It's actually because of this, because of this." The emperor did not understand. He looked at Chen Pingping as if he was looking at a monster. After a long silence, he shook his head and sighed speechlessly. Only now did he finally understand why this old black dog, who had followed him since he was young, would betray him and return to the capital to question him, even at the cost of his life. The Qing emperor knew very well how much his companions liked that woman. However, no matter what he thought, he would never have thought that Chen Pingping would feel a powerful desire for revenge and stand against him because of a woman who had died many years ago. He sat back on the soft couch and was silent for a long time with his hands on his knees. Chen Pingping's hands rested on the arms of the black wheelchair as he looked at him silently and coldly. He didn't say a word, only waiting for the answer. The Qing emperor's face was slightly pale. After a long time, he quietly said, "For her, you betrayed me?" The meaning contained in these words was disappointment and sorrow, as well as anger and irritation that came from the depths of his heart. "I just want to know why." Chen Pingping sighed and said, "In my life, I have never seen a woman like her again. No, I have never seen a person like her again. She descended into this mortal world like a fairy and did her best to change what she should change and save what she thought she should save. She helped you, saved me, saved the Qing kingdom, and made the world beautiful. Yet, you destroyed her." There were no exclamation marks or anger in these words. There was only a wave of vicissitudes and sorrow. The Qing emperor was silent for a long time. His hands slowly rubbed against his knees. In this life, no one had ever asked him this question. More accurately, no one dared to ask him this question. Not many people knew about this question. However, those who knew about this question had all become wandering spirits in the yellow earth. None of his closest companions knew about this matter. "I didn't kill her." The Qing emperor narrowed his eyes. Facing the old dog in front of him, he originally didn't need to explain anything. For some reason, there was a glimmer of pain in the depths of his heart. A glimmer of pain that he had forcefully suppressed for over 20 years slowly seeped out and took over his body and mind. He wanted the most powerful man in the world to explain something. Perhaps he wanted to explain it to Chen Pingping. Perhaps he wanted to explain it to the yellow-clothed woman in the portrait in the little building in the rear palace. Perhaps the emperor only wanted to explain it to himself. "I didn't kill her." The emperor's voice rose slightly. His tone became firmer and colder as he repeated it to Chen Pingping with narrowed eyes. "You didn't kill her?" The wrinkles at the corners of Chen Pingping's eyes were so deep that they almost covered his eyes. He raised his head tiredly and looked at the emperor. Using an extremely cold laugh, he asked, "Then, how did she die?" Don't talk about not returning from the Western expedition, don't talk about nobles rebelling, and don't talk about fate. Coincidentally, at that time, Fan Jian, Wu Zhu, Yi Zhong, everyone was not in Jingdou. Coincidentally, she had just given birth and was at her weakest. Chen Pingping's gaze was like two knives stabbing into the emperor's face. Coldly, he said, "Your Majesty rules the world with filial piety. It is best not to push all these crimes onto the Empress Dowager's body. That idiot Empress and her family have already carried the blame for you for 20 years. Do you want your own mother to continue carrying the blame? The Western expedition to the grasslands was your order." At the time, Fan Jian was only the treasurer of Taichung Temple and vice minister of the Ministry of Revenue. He was responsible for all military supplies. Why was he also moved by you to follow the army in the king's tent? Chen Pingping's eyes narrowed tightly. Endless coldness seeped out from his sparse and old eyelashes. Based on our methods in the past, military supplies and logistics were always given to Fan Jian to handle. When the Iron Riders of the Qing Kingdom went on expeditions, he usually stayed in the capital to handle everything. Why did you insist on having Fan Jian follow you into the Western expedition? What are you afraid of? You're afraid that if Fan Jian stayed in the capital, the tiger guards he secretly trained would ruin Qin Ye's plans? A cold smile rose to the corners of Chen Pingping's lips. Yes, you're bringing up the old man of the Qin family again. Who would have thought that this veteran of 3 dynasties was the killer move you left in Jingdou? Yi Zhong, who was then the Jingdou garrison commander, was also urgently summoned to Dingzhou. All of Jingdou is under the Qin family's control. Even if the empress wants to rebel and break into Taiping courtyard, if Qin Yi doesn't nod his head, who can do it? 3 years ago, when Jingdou rebelled and Qin Yi jumped out, were you happy? You finally had a chance and an excuse to get rid of the only person who knew of your role in the Taiping courtyard murder case and silence him? Chen Pingping said coldly to the emperor. Of course, you disdained killing people to silence them. Even if the Qin family said anything, you wouldn't care. However, Fan Xian had grown up. You had no choice but to accept that your son with him was the most talented of all your children. The longer you spent time with him, the more you valued Fan Xian. You also didn't want him to know that his birth mother had died to your hands. So, how could Qin Yi not die? Chen Pingping's slightly sharp and raspy voice rang out endlessly in the royal study. The emperor didn't speak. He only listened coldly and calmly. Listening to each word, his expression became slightly strange. There seemed to be a faint sorrow, but there was also a faint relief. Let's go back to Taiping courtyard 22 years ago. Chen Pingping spoke in a bit of a rush. These words were probably the words and deductions this old cripple had secretly held back for decades. Now, he finally had the opportunity to say it all in one go in front of the emperor. He coughed loudly until 2 unhealthy patches of red rose on his face. After a long time, he finally calmed down and sighed. Let's talk about me. At the time, since you had already decided to act against Taiping courtyard, you would not allow me to remain in Jingdou. Thus, the entire defense line in the north suddenly became tense. Occasionally, there would be news that the country in the north was about to attack the south with full force. As the director of the Overwatch Council and the chief military strategist, and you were busy with the western expedition, I could only go north on behalf of the emperor and personally investigate the situation. Now that I think about it, to have the entire military system cooperate with this performance and even mobilize the power of a foreign country, other than your majesty's will, who could do it? Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes and said, however, I've always had a question in my heart. To be able to make the newly established Northern Qi court cooperate with the emperor's intentions, could it be that you and Ku He are secretly colluding? Of course, Ku He is already dead. I have no one to ask. Chen Pingping shook his head. I did not look for Ku He. At this point in Chen Pingping's accusation, the Qing emperor finally opened his mouth coldly and said his first words. I did not need to look for anyone, nor did I look for anyone. Chen Pingping looked at him with a pitiful and disdainful gaze. Finally, speaking of Wu Zhu, he was the person least likely to leave her side. Yet, at the time, he left Jingdou. Without question, this is the thing I have been unable to understand the most these years. As long as Wu Zhu was at her side, no matter who in the world, it would probably be difficult to kill her. The Qing emperor's brows jumped slightly, but he still maintained his silence. Your Majesty, I've always been suspicious of you, and I've even been suspicious of Fan Jian. I still don't know which of my companions did this. The corners of Chen Pingping's lips fell. In a slow voice, he said, it was not until many years later that Wu Zhu told me that he met a person in a small alley outside Fan Manor. He killed that person and was heavily injured himself. Only then did I understand one thing. There are too few people in this world who can injure Wu Zhu, other than the 4 great grandmasters, Chen Pingping said calmly. Thus, I determined that another emissary from the temple has come to the world. Since the people from the temple could come at that time, then 22 years ago, they could also have come. You and I both know that only the people from the temple could make Wu Zhu so wary, to the point that he would leave her side and make sure the people from the temple did not get close to her. The assassination outside the Fan Manor by the people from the temple targeted Fan Xian, but the person they injured was Wu Zhu. That was because you always wanted to know where Wu Zhu was, Chen Pingping said. The first time the people from the temple appeared, they targeted her, but the person they moved away was still Wu Zhu. Wu Zhu seemed to be a wall that only the temple could move and move. Chen Pingping suddenly smiled. Although it only happened twice, both times were too coincidental. They both appeared at times when you had a motive. Your Majesty, I know you've always been afraid of Lao Wu. Chen Pingping's gaze became indifferent as he gazed calmly at the Qing Emperor. Ever since Fan Xian entered the capital, you've always wanted to know Wu Zhu's true whereabouts. Fortunately, Fan Xian has always kept it from me, so you also don't know. Why are you so afraid of Lao Wu? The corners of Chen Pingping's lips twitched as he smiled mockingly. You're afraid that Lao Wu will find out about what happened back then and bring that metal rod to the royal palace to kill you? As the emperor, are there still people you're afraid of? The emperor suddenly smiled and shook his head. No, it is just that someone like Lao Wu should not exist in this world. He should return to where he came from. Perhaps you still don't know, but when Nji was in Danzhou, I asked Uncle Lu Yun to visit Lao Wu once. As long as Lao Wu had not completely woken up, he was of no threat to me. This is what you've always thought. A monster like a great grandmaster should not exist in this world, Chen Pingping said coldly. That is why I am curious. Why are you still alive? Why don't you just kill yourself? These words were very vicious, but the emperor's expression did not tremble at all. Perhaps those emotions were brewing in his heart, but they still did not explode. Chen Pingping did not show any fear. He continued to speak coldly. Back then, you moved away all of our people and provoked that idiot empress to go crazy. Then, you had Qin Yi watch and control from the side. That was how the murder in Taiping Courtyard happened. Although it looked simple, it was actually incomparably difficult. If one of the links had gone wrong, perhaps she would still not have died. A simple and powerful plan without any flaws. In this world, probably only you, Your Majesty, can weave it. Chen Pingping gently stroked the smooth armrest of the wheelchair and sighed. Particularly regarding the matter of the people from the temple, I still do not understand why the temple would act according to your plan. Perhaps it was because your goal was always the same. You all wanted her, a person who stood proudly in the world, to be silently wiped out. Chen Pingping looked at the Qing Emperor mockingly. The Qing Emperor was silent for a long time and did not refute this reasoning. He only smiled warmly and said, "You old dog, you've spent your entire life thinking about how to harm people. It is not difficult to think clearly about these things. I just never thought you would keep this matter on your mind." However, he said with a heavier tone, "I did not kill her." "Yes, you did not kill her." Chen Pingping smiled strangely. "Of course, our great emperor would not personally kill the woman who gave the Qin kingdom a new lease of life. Of course, you would not kill the benefactor who helped the Li family sit on the throne. Of course, you would not kill the woman you loved the most. Of course, you would not kill your son's birth mother. Blood is difficult to wash away. Of course, you would not let blood flow onto your own hands." Chen Pingping's brows were furrowed tightly. His voice forced out from the depths of his chest with a threatening coldness. "Your hands are still pure white. You will always be incomparably bright and correct. The ones with blood on your hands are only those stupid or ruthless people under the throne. We avenged her and wiped out all of the stubborn nobles in the Qin kingdom. How much blood was shed in Jingdo that night? That night, all of the Empress and Empress Dowager's family were killed. Did you smile happily?" Chen Pingping asked faintly. "All of the light poured into your body. All of the darkness and shamelessness returned to your officials and family. There is nothing more beautiful in the world. Of course, you didn't kill her. Chen Pingping pressed his lips together. As he coughed softly, he slowly said, "Because you have never moved a finger. Especially after the death of the Qin family, no one in the world knows what happened in the darkness back then. No one has evidence to say that your Majesty personally controlled the Taiping courtyard murder case." However, the old cripple in the black wheelchair shook his head with slight mockery. "You will never be able to convince yourself or me. You will also not be able to change this reality. 22 years ago, you personally killed her. You killed a lonely woman who had just given birth to your son and was at the weakest moment of her life. The most despicable and shameless thing in the world is nothing more than this." After Chen Pingping said the last sentence, his whole body seemed to be exhausted. He leaned against the black wheelchair and slowly closed his eyes. The emperor also slowly closed his eyes. His usually calm face appeared slightly pale. After a long silence, he quietly said, "Correct, I killed her." After that, he opened his eyes, and they were filled with calmness and solemnity as he said, "So what?" After writing the last 4 words, I suddenly felt very cold. I don't know if it's because of the attack of the cold wave. Writing to this point, I won't write today even if you beat me to death. Recently, I've been writing about emotions, so I have to control the emotions and plot within a certain rhythm. The last conversation between the emperor and Chen Pingping in the royal study was a very important process. I have to write carefully. I won't jump scenes like Dong Mountain. Some readers are worried and smile and say, "Don't worry, I have to finish this before it's Fan Xian's turn." I will let everyone know that starting tomorrow, I will still update every day. However, I don't want to make the update time so fixed. This way, I can write more freely. I don't want to always feel rushed at 5 or 6 in the afternoon. I'm afraid the more I write, the rougher it becomes. Chapter 695. So what? It was just 4 words. However, after they came from the emperor's thin and emotionless lips, it seemed to add layer after layer of frost to the royal study. A boundless and endless coldness appeared out of nowhere and froze all of the glass windows, mahogany tables, and green potted plants in the room. It was as if there was a white frost invisible to the naked eye spreading across these things and then spreading out, enveloping the entire cold royal palace and turning the cold into ice. The coldness even pierced into the sky, attacking the balls of gray clouds in the distant eastern horizon. The cloud was like a frightened little animal. Stimulated by this chill, its entire body rapidly shrunk and shivered. Its color gradually darkened, and it had no choice but to squeeze out some of the moisture that was deeply hidden in the clouds. The wetness condensed into water and rain, slowly falling from the sky. In the Grey Jingdo and royal palace, everyone who had already woken narrowed their eyes and looked at the cloud in the sky. Only now did they know that the first rain of early autumn had finally fallen. The weather was about to turn cold. However, the coldness on the Qing emperor's body did not oppress the heavens and the earth. There was not a single gap. The color of his thin lips was not very pretty, but there was still a sliver of leeway in his heart. Chen Pingping sat in his wheelchair and looked calmly at the master he had served for decades, waiting for his next words. If the Qing emperor had never felt a sliver of guilt for what happened in the past, if there was not a sliver of hidden pain in the depths of his heart, and if his heartless nature was truly at its extreme, then he would be the person with the least flaws in the world. Regardless of who stood in front of this emperor, they would involuntarily feel a sense of submission and retreat in defeat. They would not look at him coldly like Chen Pingping. The corners of Chen Pingping's eyes drooped. If the emperor's heart was truly as cold as thousand-year-old ice, then why did he need to say those words? Although they were the coldest words, they were still words. The emperor did not accept that in Chen Pingping's heart, he could not compare to Yi Qingmei. That was why he was truly angry. For you, Yi Qingmei is still not a passerby. Chen Pingping sighed faintly. His eyes flashed past the emperor's shoulder and looked at the wall behind the royal study. It was as if he wanted to look through the wall until he saw a certain portrait. His Majesty smiled. His smile was light, cold, self-deprecating, painful, and complicated. After a long silence, he said, "I don't want to talk about the past." "Why not?" Chen Pingping narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "Do you feel that she is too dazzling and has completely overshadowed your Majesty's pride, so you have always felt uncomfortable in your heart?" The Emperor smiled mockingly and did not explain anything. He only said, "Xiao Yezi has never been someone who likes to show his face in public. So you also know." Chen Pingping cackled. There was a trace of resentment in his hoarse voice. "What on earth can't you tolerate?" "I can't tolerate it, or this world can't tolerate it." The Emperor slowly raised his head and looked straight into Chen Pingping's eyes. Coldly and solemnly, he said, "Perhaps you people have never thought of this question." His cold voice came to an abrupt end. It was clear that the Qing Emperor did not want to talk about anything related to the past. Even when faced with a companion who had accompanied him for decades, even in such a situation, he still valiantly held on to the piece of underworld in his heart and did not want to touch it. However, Chen Pingping had returned to the capital to meet his death in order to tear open the veil that had isolated this middle-aged man for thousands of years in this seemingly undefeatable man's heart. He wanted to reveal the wound that might exist in his heart. Only then could he weaken him. Chen Pingping stared into the Qing Emperor's eyes and said, "Was it the Empress Dowager's great displeasure, the powerful backlash of the nobility, or your pride that made you make such a cold-blooded and heartless decision?" The Qing Emperor's face was indifferent. He did not answer his question, but his eyes gradually grew empty. Their focus drifted somewhere. Coldly, he changed the topic. "Then, what made you make such a treasonous decision? You are a eunuch. Do you like women?" "A eunuch." Chen Pingping slowly lowered his eyelids. "I said earlier that I would be good to whoever was good to me. I have always remembered her kindness to me. Her death was tragic. Presumably, it was also puzzling. I have waited these decades to ask you on her behalf. Did I not treat you well?" The Qing Emperor's gaze gently swept across Chen Pingping's old face. Faintly, he said, "I have bestowed upon you supreme glory. I have bestowed upon you a position that normal officials would never have. I have bestowed upon you trust. Yet, you have come to ask me because of a woman who has been dead for 20 years? Chen Pingping gazed at the Emperor with a not-quite-there smile and suddenly said, "She treated me well like a friend. Your Majesty treated me well like a servant. How can they be the same?" The Emperor waved his hand tiredly. He didn't want to talk about this question that had no answer. The encounters in one's life were always wondrous, particularly with the Qing kingdom's former companions. The entanglements between them probably could not be explained even if they talked for 3 days and 3 nights. Chen Pingping continued, "I was only a eunuch in King Cheng's manor, but she never showed any disdain for me because of my crippled body. She treated me sincerely and as a friend. Ah, this is a treatment I have never enjoyed in my life. Not before her and not after her." He suddenly smiled slightly and said, "Fortunately, Fan Xian is more like her." In the quiet royal study, Fan Xian's name was particularly ear-piercing. The Emperor, who had maintained his coldness with a powerful state of mind, furrowed his brows slightly when he heard Fan Xian's name. "I don't want to talk about what Xiao Yezi has done for the Qing kingdom, the Li royal family, and us." Chen Pingping sighed tiredly. There was no need to talk about the past. It was all stored in the hearts and minds of these companions. No one would purposely remember it, but no one would forget it. His voice was slightly sharp as he said, "Yes, when you first ascended to the throne, the court was not stable. You wanted to push through new policies, but the backlash was too great. The Overwatch Council I controlled monitored the governance of officials and also caused some instability in Jingdo. Furthermore, the Empress Dowager was always afraid of that woman who refused to enter the palace, particularly when she discovered that woman's influence on you was far above hers. That stupid empress had just married you and didn't know why you didn't stay in the palace every day and instead went to Taiping Courtyard to climb over the wall. Yi Qingmei has helped you. By the seaside in Danzhou, the picture she once promised has gradually unfolded. The old Yi family has already built 3 workshops in North Min. The foundation of the Qing kingdom has been firmly established. It seems that she no longer has any use for your majesty. On the contrary, she is the most unstable factor in the court. If her picture continues, the Qing kingdom will not be the Qing kingdom it is today. Your majesty, it is impossible for you to allow such a thing to happen. Furthermore, in the process, you may offend all the officials and gentry in the world. Chen Pingping's eyes narrowed slightly and he said with slight mockery, if you want to achieve something extraordinary, you need to have extraordinary boldness, but you don't have this boldness. You also don't want to give up everything you already have. As long as Yi Qingmei dies, you can enjoy everything she has given you but don't need to bear any of the dangers she brings. 1,000 reasons, 10,000 reasons, even if you have countless reasons to kill her because of this throne, this country, and your own ambition. Chen Pingping pressed his lips together and shook his head disdainfully. But, this person is you. You don't have any right to do this. The Qing emperor's gaze remained empty. It was as if he had not heard Chen Pingping's questions that pierced straight to his heart. He only slowly said, there are still words left in King Jing's manner. Presumably, you still remember them clearly. Although her strange thoughts that deviated from the human heart were beautiful, they were poisonous flowers. Once they bloomed in the fields of the Qing kingdom, the entire Qing kingdom would probably fall because of them. As the emperor of the Qing kingdom, I have to be responsible for the people. In my life, I cherished that woman the most. The emperor turned his head and looked coldly at Chen Pingping. I cherished that woman more than anyone else in the world. What does that have to do with the people? Your Majesty and I both know what kind of person Xiao Yezi was. She was never someone who had empty thoughts but no strength to put them into practice. The words she said and the words she left behind were perhaps only things she wanted to leave behind. Chen Pingping looked coldly at the emperor. You, on the other hand, were shocked by those terrifying thoughts. Your Majesty, you suddenly realized that her thoughts were too damaging to this throne. Even if she didn't do it now, the fire she left behind might, at some point, burn this bright but actually rotten chair to ashes. Rotten chair? The emperor smiled strangely and looked at Chen Pingping. I didn't think that you, an old dog, would be such a person. Chen Pingping did not answer. He coughed twice and continued to say weakly, Your Majesty, why do you have to explain so much? Why don't you just say what you said earlier? You are just greedy for this chair. You have too many lofty aspirations, or rather, ambitions that you want to fulfill. How can you allow someone to jeopardize this process? Going back to what happened earlier, you can't forever let a woman vaguely suppress you. Hearing these words, the Qing emperor was silent for a long time. No one knew if this was tacit agreement or if he was thinking about his most obscure inner thoughts back then. After a long time, he coldly said, Did she not give me any ambitions or aspirations? Back then, I was only an unremarkable heir in King Cheng's manor. Although I had lofty aspirations, pitied the people's hardships, and wanted to change everything in the chaos of war, what ability did I have to realize all of this and even dream of all of this? The emperor said with slight mockery. It was her, you, Fan Jian, and everyone else who allowed me to walk step by step to the throne and have all of these dreams and the possibility of realizing all of this. The Qing emperor's gaze sharpened. His voice became steady and loud as he said sternly, Since I have sat on this throne, I will complete my thoughts back then. No matter who it is, do not try to stop all of this. Thoughts back then? Chen Pingping looked at him and coldly said, Your Majesty, do you still remember our thoughts back then? I know what you want to say, old dog. The emperor sat on the soft couch. The sleeves of his dragon robe spread out like clouds. A powerful and solemn aura rose from his entire body like a god among the clouds. In a low voice, he said, "I wanted to conquer a vast country and unify the entire world so that the billions of people in the 3 countries would no longer have to suffer the pain of war for generations to come." Was this not her wish? The Qing emperor's voice gradually rose. He looked at Chen Pingping with a sinister coldness. "It's been a long time since we've had a conversation like today. Only now do I realize that you, old dog, are still a character who bemoans the world. But, don't forget, I am the Qing emperor. I don't care at all about the agreement back then or what I once betrayed. But, I care about her. I have done everything I promised her. So, regardless of whether it is you or Fan Jian, even if she comes back from the underworld and asks me about my actions these decades, I can look at you disdainfully and say that only I can do all of this." Chen Pingping sank into silence. She is a mysterious woman, but, in the end, she is a woman. She is very childish. However, I had not thought that you were also childish. The emperor slowly closed his eyes. Only his thin lips opened slightly. His words were full of coldness. Governing a country is not like supporting flowers and weeding out weeds. It is not something that can be accomplished by that useless King Jing complaining about himself every day. As an emperor, in order to achieve a goal, anyone can die. Anyone can die. So, she died. Chen Pingping's body was hunched over in his wheelchair. Sorrowfully, he said, "All of the causes of chaos within the Qing kingdom can die, such as the empress, the eldest princess, the crown prince, and many others. But, I don't understand. What is the difference between the Qing kingdom of today and the Qing kingdom of the past? What is the difference between this world and the world 20 years ago? Your Majesty, you say that you are the one chosen by the world. For the sake of your goal, you can sacrifice everything. But, if one day it is your turn to be sacrificed, will you be willing to do so?" "I will certainly be the master of the world, the king of the world," the Qing emperor said coldly. "As long as I exist, the world will be better off." "It is still an empty title," Chen Pingping sighed. "Your Majesty, you are extraordinarily energetic, and your eyes are as bright as torches. The Qing kingdom's governance has never been better. But, what will happen after you die? People will always die." Shortly after, the old cripple in the wheelchair waved his hand and lightly said, "After you die, even if the flood surges to the heavens, I suddenly think of these words. I suddenly think that this question is unnecessary. Your Majesty, I still overestimated you. In the end, you are just a normal person whose heart and body have been completely taken over by ambition. Regardless of whether you are a great grandmaster or an emperor, you still cannot escape this point." The emperor was not angry. He only looked at him and lightly said, "At least the things I promised her back then have been done one by one. Is that so? Before I die, can I listen to your Majesty's explanation so that I can die with peace of mind? Just take it as the last grace your Majesty has given me." The emperor noticed the glimmer of mockery at the corners of Chen Pingping's lips. For some reason, the emperor's heart suddenly trembled slightly. Boundless anger rose in him. As an emperor, particularly one like him, the thing he could not tolerate the most was being ignored or purposely looked down on the achievements he had made in this land. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Slowly, he said, "I don't need to explain anything to a eunuch like you. After I die, I will tell her one thing at a time. Your Majesty, do you have the face to see her after you die?" Today, Chen Pingping was completely different from the past. When a person was about to die, his heart was clear, and his aspirations were strong. In front of the most powerful person in the world, he coldly and harshly scraped at his heart. "I heard that by the Danzhou Sea, you once explained these so-called things to Fan Xian. Are you trying to comfort yourself, or do you want to use Fan Xian to have her, in the unseen world, forgive you?" These words were light, but they just happened to pierce the Qing Emperor's heart. The Qing Emperor opened his eyes. They were still that strange emptiness, but his face was slightly pale. "Why would I not dare to see her?" The Qing Emperor was silent for a long time. He then suddenly laughed. His laughter echoed through the royal study. "That year by the Danzhou Sea and in King Cheng's old manor, I have already done or will do what I promised her. Everything I have done in my life, are they not things she has once hoped for endlessly?" Chen Pingping only looked at him coldly. The Qing Emperor's voice became low. He coldly said, "She wants to reform and root out the evils of the court. Fine, I will do as she says. I will change the reign, change the system, and carry out new policies. She said that you must listen to advice, so I granted the imperial censorate the right to discuss matters. She said that establishing a postal system within the country is of great benefit to business and the people. Fine, I spared no expense in national funds and used the shortest amount of time to build a postal system throughout the country. She said that the eunuchs in the palace are pitiful and hateful." The Qing Emperor glanced coldly at Chen Pingping. "Thus, I abolished the custom of sending eunuchs to each manor and duke's manor, dispersed half of the eunuchs in the palace, and strictly prohibited eunuchs from interfering in politics. She said that a country cannot be rich without commerce. Thus, I greatly supported the merchants and sent Xue Qing to be permanently stationed in Jiangnan to prevent the court from interfering in the business of the people. She said that the country would not be stable without agriculture. Thus, I put great effort into irrigation and set up a river transport yamen to repair the long river dikes. She said that she wanted newspapers, so I made newspapers. She said that she wanted lace, so I painted lace." The emperor spoke faster and faster. His eyes grew brighter and brighter. In the end, he seemed to be moved. Looking at Chen Pingping, he loudly reprimanded, "Whatever she wants, I will do. What right do you have to criticize me?" Chen Pingping smiled. It was a very happy and strange smile. He gazed at the emperor and quietly said, "You said these words very skillfully. Presumably, other than by the Danzhou Sea, you often talk to that portrait in the little building. Are you trying to comfort her in heaven, or are you trying to drive away the coldness in your heart?" The Qing Emperor's expression changed slightly. Chen Pingping slowly straightened his body and looked at him, enunciating each word clearly. Looking at him, he enunciated each word clearly. Carrying out a new policy is not a new policy just by changing the year name a few times. Restructuring is also not changing the Ministry of War to the Ministry of Military Affairs and then changing it to the Bureau of Military Affairs. Your Majesty, do you remember what the Imperial College was called in the beginning? Do you remember that there was once a yamen called the Institute of Education? The Tunguen Pavilion? What is the Transfer Office? What is the Transport Office? The new policy is not a new name. It is a new policy." Chen Pingping's sharp voice was like a whip, striking the emperor's face. Restructuring is not a change of name. What **t new policy? Making the officials and people not know what the yamen is called is a new policy? Are you deceiving the people of the world, or are you deceiving yourself? The imperial censorate discussed rumors. In the end, how did it become a lump of mud in the hands of the eldest princess of Xinjiang? Allowing them to discuss without charge? In the autumn of the 5th year of the Qing calendar, the imperial censor of the left surrendered. Those imperial censors wearing brown official robes were cruelly flogged because of Fan Xian. Who gave this order? Not to mention the postal route system. This is a complete joke. Sending a letter costs a tale of silver. Other than the children of officials, who can afford it? Other than feeding a large group of lazy relatives of officials in the courier stations, what use is this postal route? Strictly forbidding eunuchs from interfering in politics? Who the hell was Hong Xiang? An assassin entered the palace and involves court and national affairs. He is a commander eunuch, yet he has the authority to lead the investigation. Fine, even if his identity is special, then let me ask your majesty. When eunuch Yao goes out, a large group of second and third level officials have to bow and make way. What does this mean? The court greatly supports the merchants? The court does not interfere with the business of the people? Chen Pingping's voice grew sharper and sharper. With disdain, he said, how can the Ming family have so many shares of the nobility? If your majesty does not interfere with business, what did Fan Xian go to Jiangnan to do? Right now, the merchants are nothing more than a flock of fat sheep raised by the court. Building irrigation works and ensuring agriculture? Chen Pingping's smile became more and more out of tune. The river transport governor's yamen is the blackest yamen in the world. I wanted to investigate many years ago, but your majesty, you have the heart of an emperor. You know that this yamen hides the connections of half the world's officials. You don't want to shake the court, so you can only allow it to rot. What happened in the end? When the river broke its banks, how many people drowned? How many people froze to death in the winter between the 5th and 6th years of the Qing calendar? Even if Fan Xian and his wife desperately stuffed silver into it these 2 years, they could only keep it going. There's also that troublesome newspaper and lace. The corners of Chen Pingping's eyes narrowed as he looked mockingly at the Qing emperor. The newspaper she spoke of is something to open the people's minds, not some useless dog shit from the internal court. It shouldn't just have the story of me, an old dog. There should be other contents. Your Majesty, do you think I'm right? The emperor's face grew paler and paler until it was almost transparent. He did not hear Chen Pingping's last words at all. Perhaps you can convince Fan Xian and yourself that during these years, you have worked hard to do something for the Danzhou seaside and King Cheng's manor. You have worked hard to make up for something and put into practice something. Chen Pingping looked at the emperor harshly. But, you can't convince her in the portrait. It's just that she can't speak now. Your Majesty, you also can't convince me. Unfortunately, I can still speak now. The emperor was silent for a long time. His pale face matched his slightly trembling fingers. One could imagine the extreme anger and hatred in the depths of his heart. He slowly raised his head and looked at Chen Pingping. Coldly, he said, the worst thing I did in my life was when I was still the crown prince. I heard her say that the officials of the court needed an independent yamen to supervise them. So, I ignored everyone's opposition and wrote to my father to forcefully establish the Overwatch Council yamen. All the more reason I shouldn't have listened to her and let you, an old dog who can't be raised, a eunuch covered in the stench of urine, become the first director of the Overwatch Council. The Qing Emperor's voice was calm, but there was a boundless coldness in it. Chen Pingping was silent for a long time. He then raised his head and calmly said, even the Overwatch Council that I, an old dog, have guarded with my life for decades, is probably not the Overwatch Council she wants to see. The Emperor listened to the old cripple faintly say, the Overwatch Council is an organization to supervise the officials. It is not the strange and powerful secret service organization it is now, particularly when this council is yours. Chen Pingping suddenly smiled awkwardly. His eyes stared straight at the emperor's face. Do you still remember what was written on the stone tablet in front of the Overwatch Council? It was a line of shining golden characters that forever shone in front of the Overwatch Council's sinister and square building. It attracted the gazes of countless Jingdo people. However, no one would ever see these characters clearly. The officials of the Overwatch Council all memorized them clearly, but they did not know the meaning hidden behind these words. Most importantly, perhaps those people back then knew the full text of these words. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or anyone else, perhaps they had all unconsciously forgotten this point. In the entire world, only Chen Pingping and the earliest people of the Overwatch Council still remembered these words. I hope that the people of the Qing Kingdom can all become uninhibited people. When being mistreated by others, one must have a heart that will not yield. When being attacked by evil, one must have a heart that will not be frustrated. If there is something wrong, one must not have a heart that is afraid to correct. One must not suck up to wolves and tigers. These were the words Yi Qingmei left for the Overwatch Council. However, she did not finish. There were 2 more lines that, for some reason, disappeared into the dust of history. Chen Pingping gazed indifferently at the emperor. His dry lips trembled slightly. Enunciating each word, he said, "I hope that each of the people of the Qing kingdom can become a king. They can all become the one and only king that rules over the territory they call their own. Your Majesty, my king." Chen Pingping's gaze carried a burning passion and a stubbornness that he was willing to give everything for. From the beginning, the Overwatch Council was used to monitor you. Chapter 696. The royal study quieted down again. From the darkest moment before dawn to the rising sun leaping out of the earth, to the warm morning light being covered by dark clouds and the patter of autumn rain falling like cotton, the sounds in the royal study were like the weather. Sometimes it was loud and sometimes it was soft. Sometimes it was violent and sometimes it was as quiet as an iceberg. The atmosphere was even more so. Sometimes it was tense and harsh. Sometimes it was silent and iron-blooded. Sometimes it was confused as one remembered the past. Sometimes it was cold as one talked about the past. The Qing Emperor and Chen Pingping had never been a normal ruler and official. The battle between the 2 of them was very different from a normal battle. Until now, Chen Pingping was only using words. Perhaps it was only the intentions that his words represented. He held up the straw and stabbed it, hoping to prick a bit of blood out of the other party's bare and tender heart and create a fresh wound. An unhealthy paleness lingered for a long time under the Qing Emperor's face and refused to disperse. His eyes were empty. No, it should be said that they were empty. His slightly thin face, paired with his current expression and gaze, appeared particularly cold. No one knew what kind of waves of shock the Qing Emperor was experiencing in his heart. He only looked calmly at Chen Pingping. After a long silence, he slowly said, "What right do you have to monitor me?" He coldly said, "I gave up everything in the world. Do you understand what I am searching for?" This was a kind of disdain an emperor had for the old dog. Chen Pingping's hands rested naturally on the arms of the black wheelchair. He looked at him lightly. There was only coldness and disdain in his eyes. The coldness and disdain the ruler and official had for each other permeated the entire royal study. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how powerful the Qing kingdom is, you still cannot change one reality, the one you are most unwilling to admit. Chen Pingping lowered his eyes slightly and said, "In the end, the power of the Qing kingdom still relies on her legacy. If she had not left behind the palace treasury to endlessly send blood to the court, if she had not left behind the Overwatch Council to help the emperor control the balance in the court, how could you have allowed the Qing kingdom to last until now when the Qing kingdom has fought for years? You want to prove that without her, you can still do your best, even better than when she was alive." Chen Pingping slowly raised his head and said in a hoarse voice, "You want to lift the sky above your head, but in fact, you only prove that you have to rely on her. You are not as good as her." Chen Pingping's calm and natural words pierced the deepest part of the emperor's heart. The emperor suddenly thought of that stormy night 3 years ago. In Guangxin Palace not far behind, he had once personally gripped Li Yunrui's throat and said to his most beautiful sister, "No matter what, you cannot compare to Yi Qingmei." His heart slightly moved and his face slightly paled. His thin and emotionless lips were tightly pressed together as he coldly said, "History is ultimately written by living people. I am alive and she is dead. This is enough. So, Your Majesty, why bother explaining? You just need to admit that you are cold-blooded, heartless, hypocritical, and inferior." A smile appeared on Chen Pingping's face. "That's enough. Is she really a fairy? Untainted by the smoke and fire of the world? Merciful and merciful? The emperor suddenly opened his mouth and said with slight mockery, "Or is it that in your heart, you only allow yourself to imagine her as such? No, not only you, but also Fan Jian, that useless King Jing, and perhaps Nji as well. All of you think I am cold and heartless, yet you impudently used your imaginations to paint too many golden borders on her body. She is not a person, nor is she a fairy, nor is she a god who has come to save the world." The emperor faintly sighed. His brows gradually furrowed tightly. Slowly, he said, "She is only you people, no, including me in the past. She is only our imaginations. I often wonder if this woman has never appeared. Did we just allow our imaginations to gather together and form this kind of person?" Chen Pingping coldly shook his head. "You know that is not the truth. But it is still an imagination." The emperor's expression became cold. The corners of his lips curled up slightly as he looked at Chen Pingping. "You pieces of trash have put all of the beautiful imaginations of the world into her. Thus, she is incomparably bright in your hearts. You can't even find a trace of darkness. Exceptionally intelligent, but not scheming. Bemoaning the state of the universe and pitying the fate of mankind, but not a childish woman who doesn't understand the affairs of the world. She is a doer with practical methods." The emperor's eyes were cold as he continued. "What kind of person is she? A person without any flaws or flaws. Is such a person still human?" He suddenly laughed, a sorrowful and vicious laugh. "Unfortunately, there has never been such a person in the world. She is also a mortal, a normal person who has joy, anger, glory, darkness, schemes, and schemes. When all is said and done, what difference is there between her and me?" "Your Majesty." Chen Pingping slowly shook his head. "If she really was the kind of person you think she is, how could she have died to your hands? Is that so?" The emperor's pupils constricted slightly. He laughed strangely. "Ha ha ha ha, everyone becomes their own king? What an arrogant thought. So, the Overwatch Council is monitoring me. Only now do I know that you, old dog, were left behind by her to monitor me. If she didn't suspect me back then, if she didn't guard against me, how could she have left behind such words?" "Wrong, Your Majesty," Chen Pingping said with a wooden expression. Chen Pingping's expression was wooden as he said, "Regardless of who sits on the throne, the Overwatch Council will monitor them. This is not evidence that she was wary of you from the beginning and wanted to deal with you. Then what about the tyrannical martial method?" For some reason, the emperor's tone suddenly became very dark and deep. Although his voice was slightly higher, it did not make one feel any warmth. His voice was like a sword that had been soaked in the water of the underworld for millions of years, piercing directly into the surroundings of the royal study. The emperor's face did not twist. However, a glimmer of coldness flashed through his empty eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "When she passed on the tyrannical martial method to me, I had thought that she had made such a decision because Northern Qi and Dongyi each had a great grandmaster. I was deeply grateful. With this tyrannical martial method, I led you, Yizhong, and Wang Zhikuan through the battlefields and swept through everything. It was rare for me to be defeated. Who would have thought that behind this so-called supreme martial method, there was an unparalleled evil intent hidden?" After the emperor's voice left his anger, it became unusually cold. "When I first went on the northern expedition, I sensed that the tyrannical Zhenqi in my body was restless and restless. However, it had to be done. I led the army forward and fought a series of battles with Zhan Qingfeng in the northern mountains. However, it was at this time that the hidden danger exploded. In my body, all the meridians were broken." Chen Pingping was silent. He was one of the people who knew this period of history the best. The northern expedition had been difficult. Zhan Qingfeng had been extremely experienced in using troops. The Wei Kingdom's military was particularly strong. The Qing Kingdom had taken the risk of sending tens of thousands of troops to the north. It was truly a choice of death. However, the Wei kingdom was already rotten. The people had no way of making a living. If they wanted to change the situation and create a new situation and possibility for the future, the Qing kingdom had to send out troops. At that time, the Qing emperor, who was the crown prince, led the army on the northern expedition. Chen Pingping remained in the newly established Overwatch Council. For one, he had to ensure Jingdo's safety. For another, he had to maintain a distance from the battlefield and ensure that he could make decisions calmly. Coincidentally, the battle was at its most intense. When Zhang Qingfeng led the army to surround the Qing army on the outskirts of Shao Mountain, the commander of the Qing army, the crown prince, was suddenly heavily injured. All the meridians in his body were broken. He lay motionless in the military camp. Although Yi Zhong, who was a deputy at the time, and Wang Zhikuan, the young officer of the personal soldiers, stood out at the most critical moment, the Qing kingdom was already at a disadvantage on the battlefield. The commander was suddenly unable to look at the situation. In a flash, Zhang Qingfeng's army advanced. The Qing army was torn apart. The crown prince was also trapped in the mountains. It was at that time that Chen Pingping led the Overwatch Council's Black Knights to complete their shocking first 1,000-li advance. They forcefully tore a large hole in the net the Wei Kingdom's army had woven. Braving endless risks, they rescued the crown prince, who was now the Qing emperor. There was no need to mention the hardships along the way. The Black Knights were almost completely wiped out before they managed to rescue the emperor. At that time, Chen Pingping had a question in his heart. Just what kind of strange injury had the emperor suffered? There were no major wounds on the surface, but the meridians inside were all broken. He had become a cripple. During these years, Chen Pingping had guessed some things. Fan Xian had also once faced the danger of almost having his meridians all broken. He knew where the emperor's strange and terrifying injury came from. Presumably, it was the dangerous juncture that would inevitably appear once the tyrannical martial method reached a certain realm. My body could not move. My eyes could not see. My mouth could not speak. It was as if there were countless sharp little knives inside my body endlessly cutting at my organs, bones, and flesh. The emperor's gaze was empty. Coldly, he said, "That kind of pain, hopelessness, loneliness, and darkness is not something you can imagine. My will has always been strong. At that time, I couldn't help but think of suicide. However, I couldn't even move a finger. I wanted to die, but I couldn't." The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly. He smiled self-mockingly. What a tragic and wretched end. He glanced at Chen Pingping lightly. That day, if you hadn't risked everything to save me, perhaps I would have died then. Chen Pingping was silent. He did not mock or respond. The emperor's nose twitched slightly. Coldly, he took a deep breath. However, the heavens did not abandon me. After many months of such pain and suffering, I finally woke up. Not only did I wake up, but I also finally broke through the juncture of the tyrannical martial method. The emperor's voice trembled slightly. Decades had passed. When he thought of that terrifying and inhuman torment, his strong heart still couldn't stop shaking. He lowered his head and looked at Chen Pingping with slight mockery. What exactly did she want to do with this fatal martial method? I asked her how to break through the juncture. She said she didn't know. The emperor suddenly laughed. His eyes narrowed slightly. Coldness seeped out from the cracks. She didn't know. She created Ku He, Sigu Jian, and me. She actually said she didn't know. She wanted to use me as a weakness to make me listen to her and agree to her for the rest of my life. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched strangely. Mockingly, he said, "But, how could I be such a person? After I passed this juncture of life and death, I have seen everything in this world lightly. I have also finally understood that this dazzling woman in your eyes actually has her cruelest side. Since the heavens do not abandon me, how could I abandon myself? After hearing the Qing Emperor's words, Chen Pingping smiled slightly. After letting out a sigh, he continued to display his restrained smile to its fullest extent. Shaking his head, he laughed hoarsely and said, overly suspicious, overly suspicious. Your Majesty, you will probably never be able to escape this in your life. Chen Pingping's laughter was very ancient and sorrowful. He looked calmly at the emperor and said, excuses will forever be excuses. Perhaps you thought so back then. However, Fan Xian has also practiced it. If it weren't for Haitang helping him, he would probably also have fallen into that hell-like juncture. She has always had the heart of Tianyi Dao in her hands. The emperor slowly closed his eyes. But, that could forever remain in the 9th-level realm, Chen Pingping said with slight mockery. Are you willing? Without waiting for the emperor's reply, he gently waved his hand and sighed. There is no need to bring up the things of the past. Since you can even doubt her, you can doubt everyone in the world. However, this kind of doubt is a bit too laughable. Since it was laughable, he had to laugh. Chen Pingping laughed. He rocked back and forth in his black wheelchair. Murky tears almost squeezed out from between his old eyes. I just want you to know before you die that what you remember is just an illusory illusion. The emperor opened his eyes and shook off his memories. Looking at Chen Pingping coldly, he said, you are my dog, yet you are asking me on her behalf. I want you to know that the mistress you loyally protect is not a pure and untainted fairy. Chen Pingping stopped smiling. His shoulders sank slightly. After a moment of silence, he replied, I am not a saint who regards the world as my responsibility, nor do I have the right to be a saint. When I criticized you earlier, it was not for the common people in the world, nor was it because I felt any pity for them. It was just that this was her dying wish. Yes, Your Majesty, we have met today not for the common people. It is only a personal grudge. He raised his head and looked calmly at the emperor. You killed her, so I will avenge her. This is a personal grudge, not some dogsh*t righteousness. This is a very simple matter and does not need to carry any other meaning. I don't care at all what kind of person she was. Whether she was a fairy that fell to the mortal world or a little demon girl with other schemes inside, what does that matter? She is called Yi Qingmei. That is enough, Chen Pingping said slowly as he looked at the emperor. The emperor looked at his old comrade in the wheelchair. After a long time, he sighed gently. The glimmer of a smile rose to his face. However, this smile represented a deeper meaning. In his eyes, this old dog was already dead. This is a strange and chaotic emotion, the emperor said coldly. Overseeing the ruler of a country, a eunuch who can't forget a woman. So, you have already gone crazy many years ago. Of course, I must admit that I have been deceived by you for many years. The Overwatch Council is indeed troublesome in your old dog's hands. The entire Overwatch Council only knows of Chen Pingping and does not know of me, the Emperor. This is my indulgence of you, but it is also your ability. However, I do not understand. What right do you have to raise the knife of vengeance against me? What ability do you have? The Emperor looked at Chen Pingping with faint disdain. He picked up the cup of cold tea he had not drunk in a long time and slowly took a sip. Chen Pingping also picked up the still warm cup of tea from the front of the armrest of the wheelchair and moistened his dry lips. A moment later, he quietly replied, presumably, Yan Bingyun is already organizing the Overwatch Council on your Majesty's behalf. The Emperor's gaze looked at the clear yellow tea in the cup. He froze slightly and then returned to normal. Since I have returned to the capital alone, I do not want the entire Qing kingdom to sink into turmoil because of my vengeance, Chen Pingping said. Thus, I will not pay attention to Yan Bingyun. You have come to meet your death just to scold me a bit? A difficult-to-grasp smile rose to the corners of the Emperor's lips. Your Majesty understands me, which is why you have chatted with me for so long when I am destined to die, Chen Pingping said with a slight smile. Chen Pingping smiled and said, because you don't know what my final move is, so you must accompany me until I finish saying what I want to say. I have already said what I want to say. I want to see what cards you have yet to reveal. The emperor smiled warmly. He had long shaken off the earlier wavering of his state of mind and the emotions brought about by the past. He had recovered the appearance of a calm and powerful emperor. Chen Pingping did not reply. He only looked meaningfully at the emperor and suddenly asked another question. During these 20 years, I have already done so many things. Do you still not understand, Your Majesty? The emperor's finger slowly turned his head toward the celadon teacup, but his gaze slowly landed on the ground. On the ground by the feet of the black wheelchair lay a few files. Recorded on them were how Chen Pingping had, step by step, driven all of the emperor's family to stand against him during these years. The fire in Huichun Hall was set by the council. The imperial doctor was killed by someone I sent. The imperial relative also met the same end. As for the medicine the crown prince used, it was Fei Jie who personally made it. Of course, Fei Jie has long left this land. Even if Your Majesty wanted to sentence him to death, presumably, you would not be able to. Chen Pingping looked coldly and emotionlessly at the emperor and said each word clearly. The matter of the eldest princess and the crown prince having an affair was something I watched coldly from the side and helped slightly. Then, I did everything I could to let Your Majesty know. The emperor's finger that was turning the teacup stopped. That night, there was a thunderstorm. Your Majesty must have lost your composure in Guangxin Palace. Although I did not see it with my own eyes, just thinking about it makes me feel comforted. The wrinkles on Chen Pingping's face melted. He appeared very comforted. Your Majesty, why are you so angry about the eldest princess and the crown prince having an affair? Did you always feel that this sister should belong to you? However, due to your self-torturing thoughts of a wise ruler, you could only suppress it? Who knew that the crown prince would do it? Chen Pingping laughed in a low and sharp voice. What you could not do, was done by the crown prince. How could you not be angry? How could they not die? The crown prince is dead, the eldest princess is dead, the empress is dead, the empress dowager is dead, and the second prince is also dead. Chen Pingping stared at the emperor with a sharp gaze. All of the family by your side died at your hands. You are the most selfish and vicious ruler in the world. I will have your family die because of your selfishness. The emperor's fingers holding the teacup trembled slightly. Gently hitting the teacup made a crisp sound. Chen Pingping's voice was crisper, colder, and more piercing. I don't have any trump cards. I just came back to the palace to tell you. Back then, you coldly let her die alone, so I can let you also smell that kind of loneliness, and then die in this kind of torture. Perhaps I can't kill you, but isn't letting you live like this the most beautiful and complicated method? I still have a few good sons, the emperor slowly said. You even want to kill the third prince, that brat. I can't help but sigh at the coldness and hatred in your heart. Chen Pingping coldly said, as long as it is someone with the surname Li in the palace, they all deserve to die. What about Nji? The emperor's fingers tapping on the porcelain teacup suddenly stopped. He furrowed his brows and said with slight mockery, he is my and Qingmei's son. You are so loyal to her, so how could you repeatedly want to kill him? I'm afraid that even today, Nji still thinks that you are the elder who loves him the most. He has no idea that the attack in the valley, the aftermath of the Hanging Temple incident, and the fact that he almost died to a dagger, were all single-handedly arranged by you. Chen Pingping was silent for a moment. He then said in a low and ruthless voice, Fan Xian is only a bastard. What right do you have to be the father of her son? For her, Fan Xian's existence is a brand of humiliation. Just looking at him hurts my eyes. The emperor laughed. His laughter was full of resentment. Very good. You are indeed a perverted eunuch. If I just kill you like this, wouldn't that be too much to your liking? How I die has never been a problem. Chen Pingping looked mockingly at the emperor. I only know that my revenge has been successful. That is enough. The emperor's hand holding the teacup hovered in midair. A moment later, he faintly said, I still have 3 sons, but, since I have returned to the capital, I'm afraid none of your 3 sons will be your sons again. Chen Pingping's pupils gradually constricted. With a glimmer of icy pleasure, he laughed sharply and said, If I die to your majesty's hands, how will Fan Xian think of you? How will the eldest son think of you? How will you explain it to Fan Xian? Will he say that I was avenging his mother? Then, how will you explain what happened back then to him? The coldness in Chen Pingping's slightly constricted pupils flared. His face gradually paled, perhaps because of excitement or some other emotion. He stared at the emperor and said, word by word, Your Majesty, you will be deserted by everyone. In your loneliness, you will look at the land under heaven and have nothing. To look at the land under heaven and have nothing. What kind of vicious curse and hatred was this? The emperor's body shook slightly. His face gradually paled again. He looked at Chen Pingping with a threatening gaze and said in a cold voice, How dare you? When the emperor said these 2 words, it meant that he already knew of Chen Pingping's 20 years of complications. In the end, he had gradually stepped onto an irreversible path of success. Regardless of whether it was Fan Xian or the Great Prince, they were both very close to Chen Pingping. If the Qing emperor wanted to explain anything to these 2 sons, he would have to touch on the story from many years ago. It was impossible for him to open his mouth. Could it be that the most powerful monarch in the world could only gradually age and die under the furious and hateful gazes of his sons? The Qing emperor's face was pale. He felt boundless coldness and anger in his heart. He looked at Chen Pingping's similarly pale face and knew that he had already calculated everything that would happen next. He was using his death to launch a final and darkest attack on the royal palace. The royal study sank into a deathly silence. Outside, the autumn rain continued to fall slowly, wetting the originally dry ground in the royal palace and the cracks in the stone slabs. The royal study was filled with glass windows produced by the palace treasury. The carvings on the windows were like human faces looking at the final conversation between the ruler and official of the Qing kingdom. You seek death, but I do not want you to die easily. The emperor's face was pale, and his eyes were empty. Like a god forcefully suppressing his anger, he coldly and calmly said, I am going to escort you to the Meridian Gate. I am going to have you stand naked in front of all the people. I am going to let everyone in the world know that you, an old black dog, are a castrated person without a ***, a deformed thing that shames your ancestors and ancestors. I am going to have countless people stare between your thighs and see how you, a hateful castrated thief, use the rotten flesh between your legs to weave such an evil plot. The Qing emperor's words were very light, but they contained boundless hatred, endless humiliation, and endless anger. Coldly, he said, I am going to hack you into pieces and die from 1,000 cuts. I am going to have all the people of the Qing kingdom tear off the flesh from your body, bite by bite, and then bury your skull by the side of the 3 large workshops. I am going to have you watch with your own eyes how I first kill her, then kill you, and then use what she left behind to slaughter the country, unite the world, and create an everlasting legacy. I am going to have you and all of you know that I can kill you. I am going to have you watch all of this without being able to do anything. I am going to have you cry, struggle, and regret in the underworld. The emperor's face became paler and paler, but his voice became calmer and calmer. His eyes became more and more empty. He was becoming less and less like a living person. Sitting in the black wheelchair, Chen Pingping's face was also very pale. He knew that the genes of a madman ran in the emperor's blood. He also knew what kind of tragic end he would face under the emperor's crazed anger. Ruler and official used each other's words to slice apart each other's hearts. They cut each other until they were both bloody. There was not a place on their bodies that was unharmed. They were like two pale ghosts devouring each other's souls. Chen Pingping slowly and with great difficulty bent his body and placed the teacup on the ground. Then, he gripped the front of the armrests of the wheelchair with both hands. With his elbows as the axis, his two forearms rested calmly and comfortingly on the black and smooth armrests. He didn't think of anything. He only repeated the habitual action he had repeated countless times over the years. His gaze once again swept past the emperor's pale face and thin and powerful shoulders. He stared straight at the wall behind the royal study. It was as if he could see through the wall and directly into the little building in the rear palace. He saw the painting of the yellow-clothed woman's back incomparably desolate and lonely. She looked at the scene of tens of thousands of people repairing the river at the foot of the mountain. He was speechless for a long time. Chen Pingping was speechless for a long time. He thought to himself that this was good, this was good. Xiao Yezi. A strange smile rose to the corners of his lips. It was as if he could see the image of that little girl floating in the air behind the royal study. That little girl looked at him with distress and asked, "Are you really a eunuch? Then, are we going to call each other sisters or what?" The emperor heard Chen Pingping say these three words. Xiao Yezi. This name had been hidden in his heart for many years. This name was like a curse that he could not free himself from. Although he could not think of it for a long time, once he realized that he had not forgotten, that face and that person would appear out of nowhere and look at him with a glimmer of confusion, sorrow, and disdain. He unconsciously followed Chen Pingping's gaze and turned his head slightly. He then heard a loud sound. There was a loud bang. A wild wind blew in the royal study. Two violent gusts of gunpowder, iron sand, and steel balls blasted violently toward the Qing emperor's body. The Qing emperor was a scholar. He would not die so easily. Sister Pingping was a stubborn person. His revenge had actually already accomplished much in the past. He had done his best within the limits of his abilities. Furthermore, the direction of his revenge was correct. As for what he said was only to help Fan Xian in the end, presumably everyone knew. Chapter 697. Without question, Chen Pingping was an ace. More accurately, he had once been an ace. To be more precise, it should be said that Chen Wuchang, one of the eunuchs who guarded the palace back then, although he was not as talented as eunuch Hong Xiang, he was still a person ranked in the ranks. His martial arts cultivation was not to be underestimated. If he had not been an ace, how could he have stood against the powerful Xiaofan in the north during the turbulent times? How could he have built the sinister Overwatch Council under the hostile gazes of the entire court? If Chen Pingping had not been an ace, how could he have led the Black Knights to carry out those shocking thousand-li surprise attacks on the land like a black storm? However, time and experience were the most effective weapons in the world at torturing people. Too much time had passed. Chen Pingping was already old. It was a pity that during the surprise attack to capture Xiaofan and bring him back to the capital, Chen Pingping had been heavily injured. Half his body was paralyzed, and he could no longer feel anything below his waist. His cultivation had also been battered away by the wind and rain, leaving nothing behind. This was a history that all the officials and people of the Qing kingdom knew. It was a fact that they either regretted or rejoiced in. When the royal palace sent out the order to capture Chen Pingping and bring him back to the capital, regardless of whether it was Yi Zhong, Gong Dian, Eunuch Yao, or General Shifei, who was personally in charge of this matter, or He Zongwei, who finally knew this secret, none of them turned their wary gazes toward Director Chen's body or the black wheelchair he sat in. They knew that Chen Pingping himself was a cripple. It was impossible for him to have any personal power. Their hearts shivered with fear. It was not because of the power of Chen Pingping's physical body. Rather, it was because of the schemes in this old cripple's head and the powerful Overwatch Council power he could control. An irresistible thought arose in them. Chen Pingping had returned to the capital alone. The Overwatch Council was under close surveillance and the powerful cooperation of a certain important figure within. These important officials by the emperor's side all let out a breath at the same time. As long as Chen Pingping could not use the dark power his withered finger pulled, then the royal palace was safe. Because of this judgment, they were not worried that Chen Pingping would be of any advantage to His Majesty in the imperial study. Even if Chen Pingping was still that powerful warrior on the black warhorse, he would not have any power to fight back in front of His Majesty, the #1 expert in the world. As for the black wheelchair, the old dean had been sitting in this wheelchair for many years. Everyone was used to the wheelchair's existence. They even saw the wheelchair as a part of Chen Pingping. The power of habit is very strong, so strong that people can completely ignore it. Therefore, when Chen Pingping entered the royal study in a black wheelchair, no one, including eunuch Yao, felt any sense of vigilance. These important figures had made a big mistake. Similarly, the emperor had made a mistake the moment his state of mind recovered its indifference and calmness after the long conversation under the dark autumn rain in the morning. When the pale-faced Chen Pingping looked at the snow-white wall of the royal study behind him and quietly called out the woman's name, his state of mind relaxed slightly. Following Chen Pingping's gaze, he looked back and ignored the movement of Chen Pingping's arms on the black armrests of his wheelchair. When everyone was young, perhaps they had played this kind of childish and cute little game. A little friend pretended to see a stern elder or a powerful teacher walking behind him and exclaimed. He was shocked and turned his head to look, only to find that he had been punched. Then, the two of them laughed and scolded each other as they chased each other in the yard. Such childish methods were used on the Qing Emperor, the most powerful person in the world. It had to be said that Chen Pingping's thoughts were strange, ingenious, and very effective. Perhaps it was because the emperor's state of mind had been shaken in this instant, or perhaps it was because the emperor had sunk into a state of absolute confidence after Ku He and Sigurd had died and Yi Luyun had gone out to sea. He did not care about anything. Because he did not care, he turned his head. In the present world, there should not be anyone who could harm this powerful emperor. Even if Fan Xian, Haitang, 13th Wang, Yun Jilan, Lang Tiao, and the Shadow, these 6 upper 9th level aces appeared at the same time in the royal study and delivered a fatal blow to the emperor probably would not be moved in the slightest. When he turned his head back, all he saw was a patch of white and empty air. His pupils constricted slightly. When he turned his head back to look at Chen Pingping in the wheelchair, he saw Chen Pingping's hands that had been on the armrests of the wheelchair the entire time. He gripped the inside of the armrests tightly as his forearm abruptly pulled back. With a crisp click, the 2 sleek and black armrests of the wheelchair suddenly spread to the sides and made a beautiful series of metal springs. Following 2 loud sounds that rang out at almost the same time, 2 powerful currents of air suddenly shot out from the 2 holes that had suddenly appeared at the front of the armrests. Bang! Crisp and efficient, without the slightest hesitation. Cold and callous, Chen Pingping gripped the armrests of the wheelchair, the 2 armrests he had touched for countless years, and pulled the trigger. Countless metal shavings and steel balls, supported by the powerful spray of gunpowder, crashed toward the Qing Emperor's body with incomparable power. The black wheelchair emitted 2 dazzling, soul-stealing sparks. There was no one in this world who could harm the emperor, but that did not mean there was nothing that could harm him. At least, the emperor and Chen Pingping both knew that the mysterious black chest could certainly pose a threat to the emperor. Now, the wheelchair Chen Pingping had sat in for decades seemed to have a similar effect. This black wheelchair was a wheelchair the Palace Treasury and Third Bureau of the Overwatch Council had meticulously built decades ago. The pair of firearms that contained the fury of countless years were personally made for Chen Pingping by the woman who had died a long time ago. At that time, Chen Pingping had been crippled. She had been worried about his safety, so she had mobilized all of her abilities and secretly arranged such a life-saving treasure for him. During these years, the black wheelchair's seat rims and backrest had been changed countless times, but the armrests had never been changed. Many people knew that Chen Pingping had a habitual action. He liked to gently stroke the pair of smooth armrests. People close to him like Fan Xian knew that whenever he was alone and quiet, the director liked to use his knuckles to gently tap the armrests. Each time, the armrests would make a buzzing sound like hollow bamboo. Bamboo had joints, strength, and bones. Chen Pingping also had them. 2 sparks exploded in front of the wheelchair's armrests. After 2 loud muffled bangs rang out at almost the same time, the sound of countless steel balls, iron scraps, and gunpowder hitting the body of the supreme being of the 9-5 rang out. It was like rain hitting the beach, like hail falling onto the ground, and thousands of holes were formed and countless banana leaves were broken. Smoke filled the royal study but quickly dispersed. Gradually, it revealed the figure of the emperor sitting on the soft couch. The Qing emperor was a great grandmaster. In the end, a great grandmaster was not a god. Their corporeal bodies were still mortal bodies. Their thoughts were incomparably powerful, but they could not make godlike reactions. When Chen Pingping pulled the trigger on the wheelchair, he was very close to the Qing emperor. The bullets that shot out from the front of the armrests covered half the space with unusual power. Even though the Qing emperor had swept aside in an instant like an immortal, he could not escape the killing range of these soul-devouring weapons that shot out quickly. Thus, the Qing emperor did not dodge. He continued to sit on the soft couch. The walls around him had been beaten into a rotten ulcer. Gray stone and broken bricks rustled down. A few broken pieces of wall skin hung in midair. Half of the low couch beneath him had been shattered. The table in front of him had been smashed into splinters of wood. Many holes appeared on the dragon robe on the emperor's body. They were tiny, torn, and of different shapes and trajectories. The openings of the holes gave off a slightly charred feeling. A pair of hands covered his face. The index finger of his left hand was slightly bent, and the thumb was slightly raised. The bright green porcelain teacup was in the mouth of his thumb and index finger, not moving at all. Even the teacup had not shattered, so the emperor's appearance was unharmed. In reality, all of this happened in a very short instant. The power around the emperor's body was almost tangible, howling like the wind. The celadon teacup between his fingers flew through the air with a whoosh. 2 gunshots rang out. The black wheelchair was sent flying by a powerful force and slid backward at an astonishing speed. The wheelchair squeaked as it rubbed against the ground of the royal study like it was about to create sparks. In the end, it crashed ruthlessly into the wall of the royal study with a muffled thud. Chen Pingping's expression was indifferent. His pupils constricted slightly. Before he could do anything, he saw a smear of jade green reflected in his eyes. With a crisp crack, the teacup that had flown in from beyond the sky nailed ruthlessly into Chen Pingping's thin and weak chest. Who knew how many of his ribs were broken? Countless powder-like porcelain shards pierced into Chen Pingping's body like countless needles. The pain and itch were not something a normal person could endure. A mouthful of black blood sprayed out from Chen Pingping's lips and wet the front of his shirt. Immediately after, an invisible and boundless true energy surged out from the air, instantly controlling the remaining 3 meridians and 6 meridians in his body, controlling the movement of every muscle in his body, causing him to be unable to speak, unable to move, and unable to understand his own life. What was even more terrifying was that the royal Wei genuine qi actually penetrated through the air and clothes, quickly seeping into his body, following his meridians to travel in all directions, and in the blink of an eye, it slowly forced out the poison that the old dean had already consumed. It was like there was a giant invisible hand in the air tightly gripping Chen Pingping's withered body. It lifted him up from the black wheelchair and suspended him in the air. This scene appeared particularly strange. Chen Pingping's grizzled hair had long been messed up. It scattered messily across his forehead and gently covered the deep wrinkles on his face. His clothes were covered in tears. In an instant, his entire aura of life was suppressed to the edge of death. However, this old man's eyes were cold and callous. There was not a trace of fear. There was only a glimmer of regret and disdain. Gradually, even these emotions disappeared from his eyes. There was only calmness. The sound of heavy footsteps rang out in the royal study. The emperor slowly and heavily stepped on the rubble on the ground and walked toward him. The emperor's right hand opened slightly. A number of powerful jinqi broke through the air and held Chen Pingping's small body firmly in midair. Other than the coldness in the emperor's eyes, there was a glimmer of a furious blood-red color. The emperor's hands trembled slightly. They were covered in fresh blood and terrifying wounds. The small holes in the emperor's dragon robe began to bleed out and seep endlessly out of his body. It washed away the metal shards and burnt remnants of the gunpowder on the wounds. The dragon robe had already been smoked into a black paste. The emperor was heavily injured. The steel balls that could pierce through stone should still be in his body. In the end, he did not die. The shards of the porcelain cup were in Chen Pingping's body. He also began to bleed. Perhaps there was not much blood in his body to begin with, so the speed at which it flowed was not fast. In an instant, it soaked his tattered black Overwatch Council official robes. The emperor walked to Chen Pingping's side. His chest rose and fell slightly. Ruler and officials' bodies were both covered in small wounds that went deep into their flesh. The pain was at its deepest. Blood flowed endlessly. They looked very similar. He lowered his head and glanced at the ghastly wound on his chest. The corners of his brows trembled slightly. It was as if he had not thought that there would still be someone in this world who could bring him so close to death. An uncontrollable resentment and anger began to ferment and rise within the monarch's body. The emperor's hand gripped Chen Pingping's throat. He stared into his eyes. A bone-chilling hatred flashed through his eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "If I don't let you die, you cannot die." A number of gray shadows flashed past outside the glass window of the royal study. A few people abruptly smashed open the wooden door and charged in. At the gate of the garden, Yizhong, Eunuch Yao, and a few other important figures stayed far away from the imperial study, but they heard the two loud bangs clearly. They knew that something was wrong, and rushed over to protect the emperor as fast as they could, but they were still too late. Yizhong arrived the fastest, followed by Eunuch Yao. However, when they entered the royal study and saw the bloody scene in front of them, they remained silent at the same time. This was because the scene was too painful for their eyes to bear. They saw the blood-covered emperor choking the blood-covered director Chen. Their hearts were shocked and they didn't know what to say. The emperor let go and allowed Chen Pingping's body to fall from his hands. It landed on the floor with a muffled thud. He used a strange gaze to look at his old comrade, old companion, and old servant at his feet. In a cold and resentful voice, he said, "Escort him to the Overwatch Council's prison. Tomorrow, execute this traitor by 1,000 cuts. If this old dog dies before 36,000 cuts, you and the useless Imperial Academy of Medicine will accompany him in death." Yizhong and Eunuch Yao felt as if they had fallen into an icehouse. He Zhongwei, who had just run out of the royal study with a face full of panic, heard these words and trembled in fear. It was not only because of the shocking scene in front of him, Chen Pingping's crime, or the emperor's bone-chilling and bone-deep angry edict. In the 30 years of the court, there had never been a high-ranking official who had been executed by 1,000 cuts. This was the most humiliating and cruel way to die. Furthermore, this edict was directed at Chen Pingping. The three of them did not dare to say anything. They only immediately knelt down at the emperor's feet and did not dare to remonstrate. The emperor glanced one last time at Chen Pingping, who was looking at him with a mocking gaze. He suddenly felt a burning pain in his chest. "How many years has it been since I've been injured?" the emperor thought to himself. Then, his body swayed. "The emperor has been assassinated. Summon the imperial doctors." Grand Scholar, his panicked and anxious voice rang out in the royal study. Yi Chong was currently supporting the emperor's slumping body in fear. He subconsciously tilted his head slightly and glanced at the vicious grand scholar from the corner of his eye. The royal palace was in a state of panic. The imperial doctors filed in and out of the palace. Occasionally, pale-faced palace maids and eunuchs carried golden basins in and out. The water in the basins had already been dyed red with blood. Eunuch Ya was attending to the injured emperor inside the hall. Gong Jian led the imperial army and internal court aces to surround the entire royal palace. Yi Zhong, after sending out a few orders to the Bureau of Military Affairs, stood guard outside the hall. The head doctor of the Imperial Academy of Medicine walked out of the hall, sweating profusely. Yi Zhong looked at him coldly and asked, "How is the emperor?" The doctor of the Imperial Academy of Medicine saw him and replied in a trembling voice, "Teacher Yi, although the emperor is injured, his pulse is strong. He should be fine, but..." Yi Zhong furrowed his brows and shouted in a stern voice, "But what?" "But, the metal shards stuck in the emperor's skin and flesh have been removed, but looking at the wounds on the emperor's body, there should still be sharp objects left in the emperor's body and injured his internal organs. If these sharp objects are not taken out, I'm afraid." "Afraid of what? Will the emperor be in danger?" "The emperor's good fortune fills the heavens. He has never been a mortal." The doctor of the Imperial Academy of Medicine spoke in a trembling voice. He changed his method of describing the emperor's great-grandmaster realm and said, "Presumably, there won't be any major problems, but no one knows if there will be any effects in the future. Then think of a way to take them out." Yi Zhong's body was short and stout. He had always given people a gentle feeling. At this moment, the murderous aura on his face was incomparably terrifying. "I really don't have such a good method." The doctor saw Yi Zhong's expression grow uglier and uglier. He quickly swallowed and said, "However, Sir Fan Jr. once presided over a similar medical case in the palace. Please quickly summon Sir Fan Jr. back to the capital. With him presiding over this matter, presumably, there won't be any hidden dangers." The Duke of Danbua? After Yi Zhong heard this name, his heart skipped a beat. His heart chilled. From morning until now, inside and outside Jingdo, in the royal study in the royal palace, too many things had happened. He had not completely digested it all. Only now, hearing Fan Xian's name, did he think of the great impact Chen Pingping's attempt to assassinate the emperor could have on the Qing kingdom. Yi Zhong's lips were a bit dry. A moment later, he slowly said, "Sir Fan Jr. won't be back for a while. Is there any other way? The young lady of the Fan family is currently practicing medicine in the Danbua medical shop. Her teacher is Qing Shan, and Sir Fan Jr. has personally..." A cold light flashed through Yi Zhong's eyes. He straightforwardly said, "Quickly summon her into the palace." After the doctor led the guards away, Yi Zhong suddenly felt that his back was covered in cold sweat. A large patch had become damp. Only now did he have time to analyze the situation at hand. The doctor had mentioned Fan Xian's name. He couldn't help but think that, not long after, this young powerful official would use the credit of swallowing Dongyi to return to the capital. At that time, if Fan Xian discovered that Chen Pingping had already been executed by the emperor, what kind of reaction would he make? Yi Zhong felt a chill envelop his body. The emperor was heavily injured, and Director Chen's life was hanging by a thread. Another group of imperial doctors were treating him. He would then be sent to the Overwatch Council's prison overnight. He knew why the emperor had ordered Chen Pingping to be sent to the Overwatch Council in the end. The mind of an emperor still did not forget to display its coldness at such a time. Presently, all of Jingdo's defenses were in Yi Zhong's hands. He had no intention of rebelling against the emperor's edict. However, he felt a weight that was difficult to bear. If the Overwatch Council truly rebelled, what should he do? Fortunately, the emperor was only injured and not truly unconscious. There was no need to worry about what had happened between the emperor and Director Chen. In the royal study, everyone had seen Director Chen assassinate the emperor. No one could and no one dared to intercede on his behalf. Assassinating His Majesty was a crime punishable by death by 1,000 cuts. A chill rose in Yi Zhong's heart. He understood the relationship and friendship the emperor and Chen Pingping once had. The emperor was probably angry and disappointed to give Director Chen such a wretched end. Ever since the founding of the Qing kingdom, the imperial power had been as difficult to shake as it had been in the thousands of years of history on this land. The successive emperors of the Qing kingdom had always maintained a warm attitude toward their officials. Particularly during these decades, the Qing laws had been revised a few times and had abolished countless cruel punishments. Even for those who rebelled, it was often beheading and exterminating their families. The emperor had always been gentle toward scholars and officials in court. Even during the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, he had only executed the commander of the 13 city gate guards, Zhang Diqing. Compared to Director Chen of the Overwatch Council, what was Zhang Diqing? Yi Zhong slowly closed his eyes and couldn't help but think of the word scholar he had cried out in a shrill voice when the emperor had fallen into his arms earlier. Involuntarily, a chill flashed across the corners of his lips. The news of Chen Pingping assassinating the emperor immediately spread through the entire royal palace through He Zongwei's cry and startled everyone in the palace. Then, it became news that everyone in Jingdo knew. The emperor might have thought about the stability of the Qing court, the attitude of Fan Xian and all of the Overwatch Council officials, or perhaps, all of the contributions Director Chen had made to the Qing kingdom these years. No, Yi Zhong understood the emperor's personality. Even if he wanted to bestow Director Chen a glorious death, it would not be because of the friendship between the emperor and this old director. After the strange sound of the weapon in the royal study, the emperor only felt anger and hatred toward Chen Pingping. There was nothing else. The only thing that could make the emperor retract the death by 1,000 cuts was for the future of the Qing kingdom, for the moods of Fan Xian, the great prince, who was currently stationed in Dongyi, and for the sake of the kingdom. There were many ways to die. Comparing the incomparably humiliating and cruel death by 1,000 cuts to a piece of white silk and a cup of poisoned wine, the former would certainly make the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, and the great prince feel more resentment. Yet, all of this, because of Scholar He's perfectly timed cry of surprise, became something impossible because the Son of Heaven had his dignity and anger. Yi Zhong sighed and looked in a daze at the royal palace under the autumn rain. All sorts of emotions filled his heart. He didn't know how much would happen in the Overwatch Council square building tonight. Would the tens of thousands of elite soldiers he and Shifei had been ordered to guard outside the Overwatch Council really need to fight? The autumn rain slowly fell. He gently coughed a few times. He knew that the emperor's angry order could not be changed. He could only hope that when Fan Xian returned, the matter would be settled. Otherwise, no one knew how chaotic the Qing kingdom would become. The autumn rain was also falling outside the Overwatch Council's square building. It grew colder and colder. Yan Bingyun stood coldly by the window. The black cloth that had been covering the window the entire time had been torn off by him and thrown to the ground. He looked calmly in the direction of the royal palace and calmly and forcefully gave out a series of orders. Relying on Chen Pingping and Fan Xian's trust, he had already grasped a great deal of power in the Overwatch Council. However, with just this power, he was still unable to suppress the ghostly fire burning faintly inside the Overwatch Council. The black ghostly fire that grew from the hearts of these black-robed officials was a good thing. Fortunately, Yan Bingyun had made sufficient preparations beforehand. The senior officials who were incomparably loyal to old Director Chen had already been sent to Xiliang, Jiangnan, and Dongyi by him. They had already left Jingdo. Otherwise, the situation would be even more difficult to control. The news from the palace had already reached the council. The news of old Director Chen assassinating the emperor had already become reality. The emperor was heavily injured? Yan Bingyun didn't know if this was the emperor's excuse or if Director Chen, whom he had always admired, had truly done what many people could not. However, none of this was important. He coldly turned his gaze and looked at the streets and alleys outside the Overwatch Council and the Qin Kingdom's elite soldiers who were not hiding their tracks. He shook his head. He had to protect this council, particularly when Chen Pingping was certain to die and Fan Xian had yet to return. No one could oppose the emperor and the powerful state apparatus of the Qin Kingdom, even if the Overwatch Council was the most powerful part of this apparatus. Yan Bingyun turned his head and looked at the 7 leaders in the room. Faintly, he said, "Prepare to take over." He furrowed his brows. After a slight pause, he finished this sentence with great difficulty. Imperial criminal Chen Pingping. Chapter 698. I really couldn't say anything about soliciting votes. However, I had said at the beginning of the month that these were the last few dozen chapters of the year of Qingyu. I would use my utmost seriousness to write them, and I would also use my utmost seriousness to solicit votes. I would not leave behind any regrets. Chapter 699. As the words, "Imperial criminal Chen Pingping," came out of Yan Bingyun's thin lips, everyone in the secret room of the Overwatch Council went crazy. Their faces remained calm, but a glimmer of ruthlessness flashed through their eyes. They stared viciously at Yan Bingyun's face as if they wanted to use their gazes to tear Yan Bingyun into pieces. Of the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council, other than the head of the 6th Bureau, who was temporarily in charge, and Jing Gu of the 5th Bureau, who was slowly moving toward the east of the Qin Kingdom, all of the high-ranking officials were gathered there. They were the true power figures of the Overwatch Council. The head of the 1st Bureau was Mu Tai, the head of the 2nd Bureau was that old man, the head of the 3rd Bureau was Fan Xian's senior disciple, and the heads of the 7th and 8th Bureaus were all members of the Qinian unit. Including Yan Bingyun, who was also the head of the 4th Bureau, everyone in the secret room was actually Fan Xian's direct line of descent. Fan Xian's direct subordinates were also Chen Pingping's direct subordinates. Although they did not have much interaction with Director Chen, just like every official and secret agent in the Overwatch Council, the old director was their ancestor. In their hearts, he held an incomparably lofty position. Other than Yan Bingyun, the other 6 people all abruptly stood up and stared at Yan Bingyun's face. The head of the 1st Bureau, Mu Tai's iron-like face was incomparably angry. In a raspy voice, he roared, "Sir Yan, what do you want to do?" Yan Bingyun returned the gaze of these 6 people without shrinking back. Ever since they had returned from fighting in northern Qi, Chen Pingping and Fan Xian had been too lazy to deal with the complicated council affairs. In reality, during these years, all the matters of the Overwatch Council, big or small, had been handled by this icy young master. He was the young master of Yan Ruahai's manor. He was very experienced in the council. Back then, when he was only a youth, he had been sent to the unusually dangerous northern Qi to carry out spy operations. Afterward, he had been sold out by the eldest princess. No one knew what kind of cruel torture he had endured, so his reputation in the council was very high. Particularly after Fan Xian gradually took over the power of the Overwatch Council, as Fan Xian's partner and closest subordinate, regardless of whether it was dealing with the Ming family matter in Jiangnan, the battle with the eldest princess, the royal palace, or the rebellion in Jingdo, he had demonstrated a valiant ability to organize, analyze intelligence, and make decisions. With seniority, experience, effort, sacrifice, and background, Sir Yan Jr. successfully obtained a position in the Overwatch Council below 2 people and above tens of thousands. Thus, all the officials, even the heads of the various bureaus who were of the same rank in name, tacitly approved of his assignments. They admired Sir Yan Jr. from the bottom of their hearts. The corners of Yan Bingyun's eyes twitched slightly. Looking at the 6 people in front of him, he did not back down at all. Word by word, he said, Chen Pingping attempted to assassinate the emperor. Tomorrow, he will be executed by 1,000 cuts. I will accept this criminal. Do you want to rebel? News of the assassination attempt on the emperor had long spread from the palace. The high-ranking officials of the Overwatch Council had gotten hold of this information at the first moment. Amidst their shock, they learned that the old director had not followed the 30 black carriages back to his hometown to retire. Instead, he had unexpectedly reappeared in the royal palace. Furthermore, he had attempted to assassinate the emperor. None of the Overwatch Council officials believed this was the truth, much less the 6 heads of the various bureaus. They looked coldly at Yan Bingyun. In the end, it was Mu Tai who opened his mouth and said angrily, "The director has returned to his hometown to retire. How could he appear in the royal palace again? Assassinate the emperor? Who made up this rumor? What exactly happened in the palace?" The head of the 3rd Bureau, who had been silent the entire time, lowered his head and slowly said, "I thought the most important thing right now was to investigate clearly." Yan Bingyun was furious. He slammed his palm down on the long table, making a buzzing sound. In a stern voice, he said, "The emperor personally issued an edict. Commander Yi, Eunuch Yao, Scholar He, and everyone saw it with their own eyes." Investigate? Investigate what? The most experienced and highest-ranking head of the 2nd Bureau suddenly lowered his eyelids and said in a deep and raspy voice, "So what if we saw it with our own eyes? I think the emperor just wants to take action against our stupid council." This old man raised his face coldly and said, "If you want to pin a crime on someone, you can always find a pretext. If the emperor wants to kill someone, what reason can't he find? However, this matter involves the old director. Other than the crime of plotting to assassinate the emperor, what other crime can be used against him?" It was completely silent in the secret room. The glass window, which was originally covered by a black cloth, was particularly transparent. Everyone felt a glimmer of unfamiliarity. Outside, the sun was gradually sinking in the west. It shone its light onto the red palace walls of the royal palace and into the secret room of the Overwatch Council, enveloping the entire room in a blood-red light. The head of the 2nd Bureau narrowed his eyes and looked at Yan Bingyun. Slowly, he said, "Sir Yan, the final appointment of the commissioner has not been made. You have no right to order us to do anything. You have even less right to pull down this black cloth." The silence in the secret room made one's heart beat faster. All of the high-ranking officials of the Overwatch Council looked at Yan Bingyun, wanting to see how he was going to deal with this shocking matter. Mu Tai and the others listened to the words of this senior from the 2nd Bureau. The confusion in their eyes gradually grew. Their gazes as they looked at Yan Bingyun began to grow cold. "All of the intelligence reports in the council have to go through me. A few days ago, the Jingdo garrison mysteriously disappeared, the imperial army and palace defenses suddenly tightened, and the Bureau of Military Affairs secretly moved troops. I have sent all of this information to your desk." The head of the 2nd Bureau looked at Yan Bingyun coldly and said, "Looking at it now, this is the emperor's way of dealing with the old director, but you, why don't you have any reaction at all?" Yan Bingyun's earlier anger disappeared in the blink of an eye. His face was cold, and a chill emanated from all over his body. It was as if his entire person was a block of ice. "During this half-month, you moved most of the people in my bureau to Shiliang and Dongyi. Most of them are probably still on their way." The head of the 2nd Bureau looked at him coldly and said, "Presently, the strength of the council is not even a third of what it was in the past. What exactly do you want to do? Did you know about today's events long ago, so you were making preparations for the palace ahead of time? Most of the swordsmen and assassins of the 6th Bureau have also been moved out of Jingdo a few days ago." The temporary head of the 6th Bureau looked coldly at Yan Bingyun. He was the most powerful assassin in the Overwatch Council after the Shadow. His gaze was like a sword nailing Yan Bingyun. It was as if he wanted to nail this piece of ice into the twilight and allow him to gradually melt. "You must give us an explanation." The 3 most powerful bureaus in the Overwatch Council were the 4th, 6th, and 6th Bureaus. The Black Knights of the Fifth Bureau could never stay near Jingdo. Furthermore, a portion of the Black Knights had left with the black carriages. A portion was near Yanjing to receive Fan Xian's return. The Fourth Bureau was under Yan Bingyun's control. Furthermore, they were scattered among various provinces and foreign countries. It was impossible for them to gather in Jingdo. When Yan Bingyun ordered the Sixth Bureau's swordsmen and assassins to be moved, the Overwatch Council's most powerful martial force had been weakened to its limit. Mu Tai's heart trembled. He managed the First Bureau in Jingdo, so the Overwatch Council's orders and movements did not affect him. It was not until now that he realized Yan Bingyun had already secretly moved so much of the council's strength. Thinking of the shocking change in the royal palace and old Director Chen, his heart chilled. I am an official of the Qin Kingdom, an official of the Emperor, and an official of the Overwatch Council. Yan Bingyun's preparations from a few days ago had been directly exposed by these officials, but there was not a trace of guilt on his face. He looked coldly at the people standing on both sides of the long table and said each word clearly, "Don't forget the first words you learned when you first entered the council. Everything is for the Qin Kingdom." Yan Bingyun waved his hand coldly. "Loyalty to the Emperor is the only thing we need to consider. Your words earlier were already somewhat treasonous. I don't want to hear them a second time." Earlier, the high-ranking officials of the Overwatch Council had displayed their resentment toward the royal palace very well. If people outside the council knew of this, it would be no different from the crime of deceiving the ruler. Yan Bingyun slowly walked to the window and narrowed his eyes as he looked at the blood-red dusk reflected in from outside. His cold voice seeped out from between his teeth. Chen Pingping assassinated the emperor and is a clear act of rebellion. If you insist on acting your own way and collude with this traitor to do something, don't blame me for being merciless. The secret room once again fell silent. The temporary head of the Sixth Bureau slowly gripped the handle of the metal drill at his waist. He looked coldly at Yan Bingyun by the window and said, "Although you transferred away most of the people under me, I think that if the Sixth Bureau wanted to kill you, it would not be a difficult matter. So what if you kill me?" Yan Bingyun's tone carried cold disdain. "You want to rebel? Where can your family and the families of the swordsmen under your command escape to? There are 10,000 soldiers outside. Even if you save the old director, can you kill your way out?" The dusk fell on Yan Bingyun's frosty face and presented a complicated color. He slowly turned his head and looked at the head of the Sixth Bureau. Coldly, he said, "The Emperor's edict arrived this morning. I have the director's order in my hand. From now on, I am the third commissioner of the Overwatch Council. You must abide by my orders. Otherwise, you will be dealt with according to council regulations." "Sir Yan, I don't know what you are thinking in your heart." Mu Tai, who had appeared somewhat dull and muddle-headed these past few years, suddenly opened his mouth and sincerely said, "Yes, with just those swordsmen and assassins, the most they can do is save the old director in the council. They cannot send the old director out of Jingdo." "But..." Mu Tai's eyes lit up. They were particularly bright on his dark face. "My first bureau is still here. If the 8 bureaus work together, no matter who they want to save in the capital, it's not impossible. The first bureau has people hidden in each of the important yamens. The fourth bureau must also have backup. If you can't do it, Sir Yan will certainly have a way," the head of the second bureau said coldly. "The 8th bureau will immediately incite the Imperial College to cause trouble. No matter what reason, as long as Jingdo falls into chaos, the 3rd bureau will immediately act. They will poison the water in Jingdo and force Jingdo to open its doors tomorrow. Fire will burn everywhere. Once they act, it will be easy to save the old director alone." No wonder he was one of the oldest people in the Overwatch Council. With just a few casual words, he had clearly organized the actions needed to save Chen Pingping and easily spoke of such a sinister and ruthless plan. Poison the water in Jingdo? Yan Bingyun's pupils constricted. You want the families of all the officials of the Overwatch Council and the people of Jingdo to die with him? The Overwatch Council has the power to turn Jingdo into a wasteland if we are truly determined to do so. The head of the second bureau's face was cold as if he was talking about a normal matter. As long as the old director can live, what does the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people matter? Yan Bingyun's heart trembled slightly. It was not until now that he realized that the Overwatch Council he had given his entire life to had long forgotten the existence of the Emperor. All of the officials were crazy. For Chen Pingping, they would truly disregard any price and do countless crazy things. I won't give you this opportunity. Yan Bingyun's eyes narrowed. He gently knocked on the little bell on the long table. A wave of hurried footsteps came from outside the secret room. The expressions of the heads of the 8 bureaus suddenly changed. They knew something was wrong. Mu Tai's finger trembled slightly. Looking at Yan Bingyun's face, he became more and more agitated. In a loud voice, he said, "Do you want to watch as the old director dies in humiliation tomorrow?" Yan Bingyun's face was cold and he didn't say anything. The door to the secret room was pushed open. His trusted officials filed in. In a short amount of time, they controlled every corner of the room. The temporary head of the 6th Bureau continued to hold the metal rod tightly in his hand. He paid no attention to the people walking in behind him. He only looked coldly at Yan Bingyun. The Jingdo Overwatch Council was powerful, but this square and sinister building was only a brain. Their true power was hidden in each of the different yamens and dark places. The heads in this secret room were like the brains of the Overwatch Council. As long as this brain was destroyed, the Overwatch Council officials would be like a group of dragons without a head. No matter how angry they were because of the Chen Pingping matter, it would be difficult for them to coalesce into a powerful force. It was clear that Yan Bingyun had prepared for this change for a long time. After the situation in the secret room was initially controlled, the Qing elite troops that had been guarding the outside split off a column of 1,000 people and moved closer to the Overwatch Council. A series of concentrated footsteps and the metallic clang of light armor rang out around the square and sinister building. It made one feel oppressed and moved. A few faint shouts came from the great hall of the Overwatch Council downstairs. Then, it seemed that someone was reading an edict. No one in the secret room paid attention to these sounds. The 6 heads only stared angrily and hatefully at Yan Bingyun's face. Yan Bingyun looked at Mu Tai, who had a face full of disbelief, and calmly said, "In Jingdo, the 1st Bureau has the most people in control, so I cannot let you out. You can be wronged in prison for a while." Mu Tai's eyes seemed to be spitting fire. He and Yan Bingyun were both Fan Xian's trusted aides. The two of them had a good relationship. Based on his usual understanding, he could not believe that Yan Bingyun would choose to viciously stab Director Chen in the back for the sake of glory and wealth. The head of the 2nd Bureau closed his eyes and listened carefully to the sounds around him. His brain spun quickly as he analyzed the difference in strength between the two sides. After a long time, he opened his eyes and sighed sorrowfully. He knew that with the help of the court's powerful military power, Yan Bingyun had successfully separated the Overwatch Council's head from its limbs. More accurately, as long as Yan Bingyun controlled this square and sinister building, the Overwatch Council would become half useless. "Don't attack." He gently patted the shoulder of the temporary head of the 6th Bureau and had him loosen his grip on the metal rod. The head of the 2nd Bureau had the highest seniority in this secret room. The head of the 6th Bureau had a ruthless expression, but he knew that the situation was set. He couldn't help but raise his head to the sky with a muffled grunt and loosen his hand. The head of the 2nd Bureau looked coldly at Yan Bingyun and said, "We are probably all going to die." Yan Bingyun lowered his eyelids slightly and slowly said, "You don't know that Chen Pingping tried to assassinate the Emperor. As long as you don't make any mistakes, I will protect your lives." The head of the 2nd Bureau sighed and touched his already white hair. Thinking of something, he smiled self-mockingly and suddenly said, I wonder what Brother Ruahai will think after he learns of today's events. However, Sir Yen, I urge you to kill all of us old men. Otherwise, if we live another day, you won't be able to sleep peacefully. This was not a threat. It was a sincere and naked declaration. The details of what happened in the Overwatch Council would one day be leaked. If the heads of the 8 bureaus were not silenced, Yan Bingyun would certainly face the anger of the Overwatch Council officials who were loyal to Chen Pingping and angry because of Chen Pingping's death. How many of those officials were there? No one knew how many times Yan Bingyun had to die for their anger. No one knew either. After the head of the second bureau finished speaking, he was escorted out the door by a few officials. His back appeared slightly hunched and dim. This was not because he was about to go to prison. Rather, it was because he was thinking of Director Chen, who was going to die tomorrow. The temporary head of the 6th Bureau's metal drills, crossbow bolts, daggers, inner armor, poison powder, and all the weapons that could be used to kill were all found. The head's face was cold and he did not resist at all. As he was escorted past Yan Bingyun, he spat on his face. Yan Bingyun used his snow-white sleeve to gently wipe the spit off his face. Looking at him, he said, "Since you want to provoke me into killing you, why didn't you resist earlier?" "I don't want to die yet." The temporary head of the 6th Bureau looked at him and said in a strange laugh, "Because I want to see how you, a traitor, die in the end." Mu Tai was also escorted out. He turned his head to glance at Yan Bingyun and helped the temporary head of the 6th Bureau explain, "We very much want to know how badly you will die when Sir Fan Jr. returns." Yan Bingyun's expression changed, but he still maintained his silence. A vanguard of 1,000 Dingzhou soldiers, Imperial Army, and garrison troops had already been stationed in the square building of the Overwatch Council under the leadership of a few eunuchs and important figures in court. All of the Overwatch Council officials were gathered on the flat ground behind the building. It was not that no one wanted to resist. Many people did not know what was happening. In front of the Emperor's edict and without orders from the higher-ups, these loyal Overwatch Council officials would not blindly retaliate. This was the first time since the Overwatch Council was founded that it had been occupied and humiliatingly occupied. Before today, regardless of whether it was the Bureau of Military Affairs or the officials of the Hall of Governmental Affairs, none of them had any influence over this council. No army could enter here. As long as this council had the old cripple in the black wheelchair, as long as he was alive, no one dared to enter without fear. Dense footsteps rang out on the stairs. A group of people came down and walked out of the door to the large and calm courtyard behind the Overwatch Council. All of the Overwatch Council officials found that the leaders of the 8 bureaus had become prisoners. No matter how determined they were, they couldn't help but be shaken. Unconsciously, they surged forward. Just as was said earlier, the 5th Bureau was not in the capital. The 6th Bureau had been moved too much by Yan Bingyun. The Overwatch Council's martial power had been emptied. Most of the people in the square building were civil officials. For example, the officials of the 2nd Bureau who hunched over their desks and did intelligence work all had problems with their backs. For example, the skilled craftsmen of the 3rd Bureau who were skilled in making drugs had not seen the sun for a long time. Being shown by the setting sun, they all felt dazed. The officials of the 7th and 8th Bureaus were not known for their martial power. Yan Bingyun walked at the back. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the movements around him. Standing in front of his trusted officials, he walked toward the eunuchs and officials in front of the imperial soldiers. The one leading the army into the Overwatch Council was Zhongwei. He looked at the frosty Yan Bingyun and nodded his head slightly in greeting. An old eunuch at his side bent his body and said to Yan Bingyun, "Can you announce the edict?" Yan Bingyun furrowed his brows and said, "Have these soldiers put down the knives and spears in their hands. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that they won't all be poisoned to death in a moment." The old eunuch paused slightly. After using his gaze to ask for Zhongwei's meaning, he signaled to the commander of the 1,000-man group. The commander's heart chilled slightly, but he obeyed and ordered the mixed troops to put down the knives and spears in their hands. The atmosphere immediately relaxed a little. Yan Bingyun did not give the Overwatch Council subordinates any chance to react. The group escorting the heads of the 8 bureaus had already left the council and headed toward the prison. A clamor immediately broke out. Yan Bingyun nodded his head in greeting to the bent old eunuch. The old eunuch's body trembled as he walked in front of the 200 or so Overwatch Council officials. Clearing his throat, he began to slowly read out the crimes of the previous director of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping, for plotting rebellion and attempting to assassinate the emperor. The atmosphere became more and more oppressive. All of the Overwatch Council officials' faces became more and more shocked. The emotions in their eyes became more and more complicated. The suspicion and anger that came from the bottom of their hearts grew stronger and stronger. The old eunuch's voice became lower and lower and more panicked. It was as if he could not go on. The commander of the mixed elite Qing army also became more and more nervous. Although none of the 200 Overwatch Council officials were skilled in martial arts, who knew what kind of powerful figures they were before they became civil servants. Wang Qinian, one of the 2 wings of the Overwatch Council, had once hidden in this building as a scribe for many years. If these people truly rebelled in anger, what kind of ending would there be? Although the 3rd Bureau officials did not carry weapons, who knew how the poison on their bodies would be spread? The atmosphere in the courtyard grew more and more tense. It was as if it could break at any moment. Coincidentally, the old eunuch finished reading the edict. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and cried out in his heart that he had been lucky. Although the Overwatch Council officials showed deep suspicion, shock, and anger in their eyes, not a single one of them moved. This was a true iron army, a group made of iron. As long as their superiors did not give the order, they would continue to wait until they could wait no longer. Countless gazes looked at Yan Bingyun standing at the very front because he was the highest-ranking official in the Overwatch Council. Although there was suspicion in these gazes, they still waited for Yan Bingyun to speak. Yan Bingyun was silent for a moment but did not open his mouth to explain anything to these Overwatch Council officials. Instead, he looked directly toward the tunnel in the courtyard. A few imperial doctors, a few eunuchs, and dozens of internal guards carried a stretcher and walked in from the tunnel. A skinny old man with a head full of messy white hair was on the stretcher. The blood on his body had already stopped. However, he seemed to still be unconscious. The ancestor of the Overwatch Council, the emperor of this patch of darkness, Chen Pingping, once again returned to the Overwatch Council he had single-handedly created. He returned to his favorite courtyard. However, none of this was accompanied by the familiar creaking of the wheelchair. He just lay alone on the stretcher. In the courtyard at the beginning of autumn, the fish in the white sand pond were still swimming. However, Chen Pingping could not open his eyes and glance in that direction. Yan Bingyun stood straight like a javelin. Looking at the approaching stretcher, the hands behind his back trembled slightly. They immediately returned to normal. He knew this was a crucial moment. He knew why the emperor had sent Chen Pingping back to the Overwatch Council to be locked up. It was because he wanted to use the old director, who was about to die, to be executed by 1,000 cuts, to stimulate the hearts of everyone in the Overwatch Council. The emperor had to know whether this Overwatch Council was Chen Pingping's or his own. Once he confirmed that the council was no longer his, the cold, emotionless, and powerful emperor would presumably not mind using countless soldiers to charge into this dark courtyard and the countless branches under heaven to thoroughly clean it and not leave any traces in the world. He coldly watched the reactions of all of the Overwatch Council officials in the courtyard. He watched the incomparably powerful and deeply rooted imperial power collide with Chen Pingping's lofty prestige in the Overwatch Council. The stretcher slowly moved. Under the rescue efforts of the imperial doctors, Chen Pingping, who had lost too much blood, managed to survive. The emperor did not allow him to die so easily and happily, so he could not die. Following the movement of the stretcher, the gazes of the Overwatch Council officials in the courtyard also moved. Their gazes were complicated, sorrowful, excited, hopeless, and angry. On the stretcher was the old man they all loved and respected. However, he could only lie dimly on the stretcher and prepare to welcome his wretched end the next day. Finally, someone could not resist crying out wretchedly and kneeled on the ground facing the stretcher. Director. Old director. All of the Overwatch Council officials knelt down. Although the edict had clearly stated that Director Chen was a heinous criminal who had tried to assassinate the emperor, they still could not resist kneeling down. Finally, someone could not resist. With a sharp cry, a few figures flew out from the crowd of Overwatch Council officials and headed straight for the stretcher. A few streaks of cold light sliced through the air. A few muffled thuds rang out. The air seemed to twist because of the vibrations. The autumn wind picked up and whistled through the air. When the dust settled, 4 Overwatch Council officials had been struck to the ground. The military aces who had attacked at the same time, as well as the internal court aces around Chen Pingping, all returned with their hands tied. Yan Bingyun watched this scene coldly. The corners of his eyes twitched slightly. He said, "Take them away. If there are any more rebellious actions, they will be dealt with according to the council's rules." Countless venomous and angry gazes turned toward Yan Bingyun at the same time. If looks could kill, Yan Bingyun's body would already be riddled with holes. However, his face was only slightly pale, and the lines on his sleeves did not move at all. He looked at his subordinates in the courtyard and said in a cold voice, "Remember your mission. Do you, officials of the Qin Kingdom, want to rebel?" At this moment, He Zongwei, who was standing beside him, suddenly said softly, "It's best to kill him on the spot to shock people. Since when is it your turn to talk when I do things?" Yan Bingyun threw out a sentence coldly. His words could make He Zongwei silent, but they could not make the officials of the Overwatch Council silent. They slowly rose and used a cold gaze to look at He Zongwei like they were looking at a dead person. Perhaps in the next moment, they would collectively attack and charge toward the stretcher. The situation in the Overwatch Council had reached a critical juncture. Yan Bingyun narrowed his eyes and looked around. He knew that he alone could not suppress these officials' love and respect for Chen Pingping. An old and wizened finger suddenly stretched out. Everyone fell silent. The gazes of all of the Overwatch Council officials turned toward the old finger, the finger that stretched out beside the stretcher. The finger changed slightly and made a gesture that all of the Overwatch Council officials remembered by heart. Ho! An official of the Second Bureau suddenly felt great sorrow in his heart. His eyes grew wet as he gave a loud roar of grief and anger. He then knelt down heavily on his knees. Ho! Ho! The old finger seemed to have some kind of magic. It only stretched out gently and shook. Immediately after, countless cries of "Ho!" rang out in the courtyard. Ho was silence. Ho was waiting. Ho was enduring silently. Ho was having no choice but to give up. Ho was staying where he was. All of the Overwatch Council officials stayed where they were. After the word "Ho" left their mouths, 2 lines of tears flowed down. Their knees were not heavy, but they were as heavy as mountains. They fell to the ground and watched as the stretcher slowly moved in front of the heavy person. All of the internal court aces, eunuchs, and military elites watched this scene with moved expressions. He Zongwei's face became deathly pale. Yan Bingyun's body swayed slightly. The dark fire of the Overwatch Council officials that could not be suppressed no matter what method they used was temporarily extinguished without any objection by the old finger. What kind of prestige? No, what kind of faith was this? Yan Bingyun's face was like ice. He knew that although the battle between the royal power and the old director had ended with the Overwatch Council being forced to submit, in reality, Director Chen had still won. The stretcher slowly moved in front of everyone and headed in the direction of the Overwatch Council's prison. He Zhongwei looked at this scene with a deathly pale face. Suddenly, he saw the 4 captured Overwatch Council officials. He didn't know if he was trying to relax his state of mind or convince himself that the Overwatch Council was not that scary, but he unconsciously said in a quiet voice, "The Overwatch Council is indeed ordered as one. However, these people's strength is weaker than I imagined." Yan Bingyun turned to look at him coldly. After a slight pause, he said, "If it wasn't for the fact that I was shameless to this extent, if it wasn't for the fact that the old headmaster could still move a finger, I really can't imagine if the 2 of us would be able to leave this courtyard alive today." After saying this, he paid no more attention to He Zhongwei, who had his head lowered in thought. Following the stretcher and the guard sent by the palace, he walked desolately toward the Overwatch Council's prison. Chapter 700. While betrayal, submission, and the verge of collapse played out in the Overwatch Council, the entire Jingdo was enveloped in a strange and oppressive atmosphere. It was impossible for the little court conference to be held again. Although the various ministries and yamens carried out their routine work, the shocking news coming out of the royal palace had long made the Qing officials tremble in their bodies and minds. No one had any thoughts on state affairs, and no one dared to whisper in the yamens. Occasionally, there would be officials who were on good personal terms who would meet in a secluded place and pass on the news they knew. The emperor had been assassinated. The heinous and unforgivable traitor was Director Chen. This news made everyone feel shocked and incredulous. However, the truth was right in front of their eyes. Other than feeling it absurd and shocked, these civil officials all turned their gazes toward the Overwatch Council. A faint worry rose in their hearts. They didn't know if the court would be able to control the council under these circumstances. Fortunately, news that calmed people's hearts came endlessly. At least for now, these officials didn't seem to have to worry too much. After the major incident broke out in the morning, the various ministers, dukes, and elders of the Hall of Governmental Affairs immediately rushed to the royal palace. After another few hours, these officials retreated from the royal palace and began to deal with state affairs anew, leaving only Hu the scholar to stand guard in the royal palace. The most important matter in the Qing court was the trial of Chen Pingping's rebellion. All the ministries and yamens were mobilized. This was the first time the civil official system had independently investigated such an important case outside of the Overwatch Council's eyes. No one knew how the various ministries and yamens felt. Other than sorrow and shock, did they feel much more relaxed? However, the emperor's edict was clear, urgent, and cold. The so-called trial was nothing more than a formality. In less than 4 hours, the various ministries and yamens of the Qing court, led by the Supreme Court, had drafted up reports on Chen Pingping's numerous major crimes and sent them to the royal palace. However, these reports were immediately rejected. It was clear that the emperor, who was still in a rage and had yet to recover, was not satisfied with the charges these civil officials had drafted. The emperor would not let Chen Pingping die easily and freely. Since Chen Pingping thought he was standing on a glorious and righteous stand to interrogate and seek revenge, then the emperor wanted Chen Pingping to lose all of his reputation and die with endless humiliation and accusations. It was not difficult to fabricate a crime, but to pin it on Chen Pingping made these court officials fall into a state of panic. However, His Majesty strictly ordered this, so no one dared to have any objections. They could only tremble and put all kinds of crimes of treacherous officials that had appeared in the history books on Chen Pingping. When the 13 crimes were finally sorted out, Chen Pingping finally became the most heinous and unforgivable traitor in history. A voice of approval finally came from the imperial palace. It was clear that Chen Pingping could no longer escape the crime of death by 1,000 cuts. Everything happened very quickly. Other than shock, all of the court officials couldn't help but have some suspicions. If it was truly a case of treason, once it was investigated according to usual practice, it would probably take a few years. If Director Chen was the main culprit, he would not be executed so easily. Furthermore, the officials involved in this case of treason probably numbered in the thousands. However, the injured emperor only seemed to be throwing his anger onto Chen Pingping alone and did not want this matter to be dragged into too much. Finally, there were officials who guessed the emperor's thoughts and couldn't help but feel a chill. The emperor hated Chen Pingping to the extreme, so he had to execute Chen Pingping openly in front of millions of people. The reason the emperor forced the entire court to speed up the process of this matter was because Chen Pingping not only ordered Chen Pingping but also represented the Overwatch Council. The new director of the Overwatch Council, the powerful Sir Fan Jr., was on his way back to Jingdo from Dongyi. If it was a normal official, the emperor would probably not care at all. He would even coldly and cruelly wait for his return and then have Chen Pingping die in front of him, once again touching his bloody heart. However, Fan Xian was not a normal official. The power in his hands was too great. It was so great that even the emperor had to consider it for the future of the Qin kingdom. Most importantly, he was the emperor's own son. Without killing Chen Pingping, it would be impossible to vent the resentment accumulated in the emperor's heart. However, the emperor had to finish this matter before Fan Xian returned to Jingdo and make these matters an irreversible reality. The entire imperial court was extremely busy because of the shocking assassination case that happened in the imperial study in the early hours of the morning. In the south of Jingdo, the Fan Manor with the stone lions by the door that looked down on the world with cold and disdainful eyes sank into a strange silence. It was just past noon. The news of the emperor's assassination had just gotten out of the royal palace. Chen Pingping had not yet been sent to the Overwatch Council's prison. An edict announcing eunuch, accompanied by internal guards and imperial soldiers, had already entered the Fan Manor through the middle door. There was no incense table or ceremony to receive the edict. The people of the Fan Manor eating lunch in the little flower hall immediately paled when they heard the eunuch's words. As the mistress, Lin Wan, slowly rose. Staring at the eunuch, she said each word clearly, "Say that again." The eunuch knew that the emperor was waiting in the palace to be treated. Faced with Princess Chen's cold questioning, he did not get angry. Using an urgent voice, he repeated himself. A glimmer of fear flashed through Lin Wan's eyes. She unconsciously turned her head to glance at her sister-in-law beside her. Fan Ruoruo's face was also slightly pale. Presumably, anyone who heard this news would show the same expression, particularly the women in the Fan Manor. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or Chen Pingping, whose life or death was unknown, their connections to the Fan Manor were too deep and tight. They could not be torn apart no matter what. Lin Wan knew what kind of feelings her husband, Fan Xian, who was not in Jingdo, had for Chen Pingping. However, the emperor was, after all, Fan Xian's father and her uncle. Fan Ruoruo put down the bowl and chopsticks in her hands and looked at her sister-in-law. Gently biting her lip, she did not say anything. Her fingers trembled slightly. Lin Wan's large eyes gradually calmed. She lowered her head slightly and asked, "Is the emperor in danger?" The eunuch did not know the inside story. He could not even enter the palace where the emperor was staying, so he could not say what was going on. They had only come under Commander Ye's orders and listened to the suggestion of the Imperial Academy of Medicine to invite, or escort the young lady of the Fan family into the palace to save the emperor. Hearing Princess Chen's question, he could only shake his head fearfully. Lin Wan glanced at Fan Ruoruo. Fan Ruoruo lowered her head slightly and did not think about anything. She stood up and lightly said, "I'm going into the palace." After saying this, Fan Ruoruo left the dining table and followed the eunuch and soldiers out of the Fan Manor. Her medical chest was still in the Donbua medical shop on Dongchuan Street, so she had to make a detour there. Seeing her sister-in-law's figure disappear through the manor doors, a strong worry and unease rose again into Lin Wan's eyes. She said to the wife of the Tang family standing to the side, "Send a few clever people to wait outside the palace." If there is any news, quickly report back. Yes. The wife of the Teng family also knew that something big had happened today. Maintaining a serious expression on her face, she made a sound and prepared to turn to make arrangements. Then, she heard the matriarch's second sentence. Have Teng Zijing come. I have something to tell him. The expression on Lin Wan's face was very cautious. Other than slight nervousness, there was more worry. She was deep in the Fan Manor and had no idea what had happened outside. She also didn't know what had happened in the royal palace, why the old director had suddenly returned to Jingdo, or what had happened between the emperor's uncle and the old director in the royal study. From the Jingdo rebellion 3 years ago, she knew that the cold emperor would not give the old director any chance to live. She also knew that if Fan Xian was in Jingdo right now, he would not just watch as this happened. Because she knew Fan Xian's attitude, she also knew that the Fan Manor's position in this matter was very dangerous. If they were not careful, they would probably be consigned to eternal damnation. She glanced at Cece beside her and quietly ordered, in a moment, when Teng Zijing arrives, I'll have them arrange for you to leave the capital first. Take Shunning and Liangzi and hide in the country estate outside the capital for a while. Cece was not surprised by this kind of arrangement. After all, she was one of the 4 serving girls Fan Xian had personally raised. Although she had followed the mistress in the manor to deal with family and clan matters, she had not thrown away those sensitivities. In particular, Cece was no stranger to leaving the capital to hide. When she was pregnant with Fan Xian's first child, it was during a tense time of the Jingdo rebellion. Master Fan Jian had arranged for her to hide in Chen Garden. Chen Garden? Cece looked at the mistress and suddenly said, the young master is indebted to the old director. Lin Wan sighed and gently nodded. But, such a big thing has happened. Who can turn it around? Don't talk for now. Quickly pack up and leave the manor in a moment. At this time, the city gates should already be closed. Jingdo is about to be locked down. If Teng Zijing takes them, I'm afraid they won't be able to get out, Cece reminded. During these years, Fan Xian's wife and concubine had helped him deal with clan and family matters, as well as the details of the Jiangnan Hangzhou conference. The 2 women, 1 maid and 1 assistant, worked well together. Their tacit understanding grew deeper and deeper. Lin Wan was the one who made the decisions, and Cece was the one who filled in the gaps from the side. Lin Wan had also given her own son to Cece to take with her. She trusted her greatly. Her brows furrowed slightly. That is why we have to hurry. As she spoke, an Overwatch Council secret agent wearing black official robes appeared outside the flower hall. Earlier, Lin Wan had already secretly notified the member of the Qinian unit who had always been protecting her, so she was not surprised to see him appear. Slowly walking to the edge of the flower hall, she looked at him and asked worriedly, "You've heard everything. Immediately send someone to the outskirts of the Overwatch Council to see what is going on. Then, make arrangements to have Guard Teng take them away." The member of the Qinian unit nodded his head heavily. As a subordinate of the Overwatch Council, his mood was unusually heavy and shocked. However, he knew that the young madam's orders were unusually clear. The Overwatch Council was certainly heavily surrounded. It would be difficult to make contact with the council. He made a hand gesture behind him, and the member of the Qinian unit went to make arrangements. Lin Wan looked at him and said, "Send someone to Yanjing. If they meet Fan Xian on the road." Her brows furrowed. The member of the Qinian unit looked at her nervously, waiting for her final decision. "Tell him the truth." A resolute expression flashed across Lin Wan's face. "Just say that Director Chen is going to die." The person let out a breath and glanced at her gratefully. He then left to prepare everything. The interior of the Fan Manor became busy in an orderly fashion. Only Lin Wan was left alone in the flower hall. She thought about what had suddenly happened today. Suddenly, she felt a gust of cold wind blow in from all directions, making her shiver. She had already managed the Fan Manor's affairs for 3 years. In addition to managing the Hangzhou conference and clan affairs, the youthful Lin Wan already had the air of a mistress of the household. Clear and powerful orders were sent down. Everyone in the Fan Manor began to respond in an orderly manner. At the side door of the garden in the back of the manor, Lin Wan took the servant girl and her son from the nanny's hands. She gave the two of them a firm kiss on the cheeks and gave Cece a few more reminders before having the carriage move. Beside her, Teng Zijing lowered his voice and said, "Leaving the capital at this time might be a bit eye-catching." Lin Wan glanced at him. She knew that although this guard, who was loyal to the Fan family, had also been shocked by the assassination attempt in the royal palace, he still thought that her reaction was a bit too intense. She shook her head and said, "Although it's a bit eye-catching, it's best to leave as soon as possible." There was one thing she didn't explain to Teng Zijing. Although the Qinian unit had already sent someone to inform Fan Xian, the journey was long. By the time Fan Xian returned, Chen Pingping would already be dead on the execution field. Lin Wan knew the emotions hidden under Fan Xian's gentle exterior. Who knew what kind of intense reaction Fan Xian would have at that time? It was precisely because she had anticipated Fan Xian's intense reaction that Lin Wan's reaction appeared so nervous and urgent. "Don't worry about this. In a moment, I'll personally go into the palace to take a look." Lin Wan nodded slightly at him. Teng Zijing sighed and bowed. He then chased after the carriage not far away. Lin Wan returned to the manor and, in the shortest amount of time, gathered all of the guards, servants, and people in the Fan Manor. In a cautious tone, she told them what they had to pay attention to, particularly forbidding any private discussion. She was the mistress of the Fan Manor. Although she had always been known for her simple-mindedness, her management of the family these few years had long established her prestige in the manor. With Jingdou in chaos, everyone knew that the Fan Manor was also one of the centers of chaos. The servants all agreed in unison and did not dare to feign ignorance. Lin Wan's gaze slowly swept around and roughly calculated the power that could be mobilized in the manor. The Qinian unit did not leave many people in the manor. Most of them were the swordsmen and guards of the 6th Bureau. These people had to ensure the safety of the Fan Manor, so it was not convenient to send them out. However, Debao had gone to Old Lin Manor to bury crickets. Now that such a major event had occurred, she had to immediately send someone to bring him back. She immediately thought of another matter and gently waved her hand to summon the official of the Qinian unit. In a quiet voice, she said, "Send someone from the 1st Bureau as well. They don't need to do anything. Just maintain contact." Although the Overwatch Council's news had yet to come back, Lin Wan knew that given her uncle's imperial wisdom, that square and sinister building must be under the suppression of a powerful military force. However, the 1st Bureau was close to the Supreme Court, so there might be some loopholes. Everything Lin Wan did was actually just to prepare for Fan Xian. She knew that once Fan Xian returned to the capital, what he needed to know the most was the truth. Although she did not want Fan Xian to take risks or go crazy, if her husband was truly going crazy, as his wife, she could only make some necessary preparations for his madness. After making all of these arrangements, she ordered the Fan Manor to tightly close the main doors. Other than when an edict personally arrived, all internal and external traffic was strictly prohibited. Only then did Lin Wan relax slightly. She sat in the carriage that had been prepared earlier and drove out of the streets in the south of Jingdou toward the vast and particularly austere royal palace in the north. Today, the imperial palace was heavily guarded. The density and strength of the imperial army's patrols could not be compared to the past. Everyone's faces carried a trace of nervousness and sternness. It seemed that even though the old director Chen was already seriously injured and captured, no one would feel relaxed. Lin Wan got off the carriage and came directly to the palace doors. She had grown up in this royal palace and was deeply loved by the Empress Dowager and the Emperor. She was an anomaly in the palace. In the past, she could enter and leave the palace without obstruction. Now, she was forced to stop at the palace doors. The commander of the imperial army, Gong Dian, glanced at her with a complicated gaze. After he bowed to her, he said, "The emperor has ordered the palace to be sealed today." Lin Wan erased her face. Her large eyes were calm and without any ripples. Without shrinking back, she said, "The emperor has been assassinated. I want to enter the palace to visit. Is that not allowed?" Gong Dian furrowed his brows slightly. The so-called sealing of the palace was actually a selective lock. Logically speaking, Princess Chen was the emperor's favorite niece. It was only right and proper for her to enter the palace. The problem was, the source of the chaos was the Overwatch Council. Everyone under heaven knew that Princess Chen was the wife of the current director of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. "I just don't know if the emperor wants to see you," Gong Dian said in a heavy voice. Lin Wan's heart tightened slightly. She knew what General Gong Dian's secret reminder meant. He was worried that she would enter the palace to ask the emperor for mercy on behalf of Chen Pingping. If anyone dared to ask the emperor for mercy, it would probably make the emperor angry, particularly since her identity was complicated. Once she opened her mouth to ask for mercy, it might instead intensify the conflict and make the emperor feel strange toward the Overwatch Council and even Fan Xian, who was not in Jingdo. She was silent for a moment. She then forced a smile and said, "I heard a few scholars are in the palace. King Jing has also entered the palace. I want to go in and see." After a slight pause, she quietly said to Gong Dian, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." Gong Dian sighed and ordered the soldiers behind him to make way. After entering the royal palace, Lin Wan smoothly entered the rear palace. Her pace was fast. By the time she arrived in front of the emperor's bedroom, a few beads of sweat had already appeared on the tip of her nose. Her cheeks were slightly red. However, she could only walk to the bedroom. No one could enter. Lin Wan looked at the people around her and paused slightly. She saw Yi Guipin pushing the third prince's hand and looking at the tightly shut palace door with a face full of worry. The great prince's birth mother, Pin Ning, had a particularly cold expression. Accompanied by serving girls, she stood alone on the other side. King Jing stood at the palace door and was quietly saying something to Yi Zhong. On the right-hand side of the stone steps, the head of the court civil officials, Hu the scholar, had a heavy expression. Behind him were the other two scholars of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. He Zhongwei had already escorted Chen Pingping to the Overwatch Council, so he was not there. What surprised Lin Wan the most was that the former Grand Scholar, Mr. Xu Wu, who had resigned 3 years ago and only spent his time at home with his grandson, had also come to the main hall. His sunken eyes looked at the tightly shut door of the hall, maintaining a silence that was completely contrary to his violent temperament. Everyone saw that Princess Chen had come and each separated to greet her. However, Hu the scholar looked at her with a worry similar to Gong Dian's. It looked like these major figures of the Qing court were all worried about the same thing after this matter. They were worried about the Overwatch Council's reaction after the emperor executed Chen Pingping, particularly Fan Xian's reaction. Of all the people present, Lin Wan was the closest to Lady Ning. Ever since she was young, she had often eaten and slept in Lady Ning's courtyard. Seeing that Lady Ning's expression was slightly strange, her heart thumped. After bowing to the scholars, she came to King Jing's side. "Ruoruo has already been in there for an hour." King Jing seemed to know what his seemingly muddle-headed niece, who was actually as smart as her mother, wanted to ask. Dimly, he said, "Other than her, the emperor has not seen anyone else. Don't think about using the emperor's favor to barge in and ask for mercy for that old dog." The major figures present all had their own thoughts. No one noticed the conversation between King Jing and Princess Chen. After Lin Wan heard King Jing's words, her expression darkened slightly. She lowered her head and quietly said, "Is the emperor all right? A scourge lives for 1,000 years. How could he die so easily?" King Jing said in a low voice with a false smile. Lin Wan's heart jumped. She had not thought that King Jing would say such treasonous words in the royal palace. When she had entered the palace earlier, she had thought of seeing the emperor and pleading for mercy on behalf of the old director. Like Fan Xian, she understood the emperor's personality very well. She knew that at this juncture, it was impossible for the old director to escape death. On the way into the palace earlier, I received news that it was to be executed by 1,000 cuts. Lin Wan's face was slightly pale as she asked King Jing for confirmation in a trembling voice. King Jing glanced at her and said, "It looks like although the Overwatch Council has been temporarily abolished, Fan Xian has still left some people for you." "Not bad, my brother's meaning is clear." Lin Wan's voice trembled slightly. "Is there no mercy beyond the law? After all, the old director is not a normal person. I know what you're worried about and what those people are worried about." King Jing's gaze was muddy. He sighed and said, "That old dog has offended too many people. Do you think those civil officials are willing to ask for mercy from the emperor on his behalf? They are just worried that Fan Xian will go crazy." He looked at Lin Wan and shook his head sorrowfully. "The emperor is not seeing anyone. It is clear that he has already made up his mind. There were many ways to die." The figures who entered and left the royal palace did not care much about life and death because the coldness of the dragon chair had long made them aware of this. However, how he died was a very important matter. If Chen Pingping ended up with his reputation in tatters and a fate of being hacked to pieces, the resentment hidden within the Overwatch Council would be washed away by this bloody light. No one knew how chaotic the Qin kingdom would become. Chen Pingping's attempt to assassinate the emperor was, without question, a capital offense. If he was ordered to commit suicide, even if it was beheading or hanging, perhaps it would demonstrate the emperor's magnanimity and eliminate the violent currents this matter would bring. However, no one knew what kind of conversation the ruler and official had in the royal study that made the emperor show a rare resentment and anger. He wanted Chen Pingping to die in the most wretched state. Lin Wan listened to King Jing's words and fell silent. If the emperor could be slightly more magnanimous, perhaps Fan Xian, who was about to return to Jingdo, could accept it more. Of course, all of this was built in their imaginations. No one knew what kind of true reaction Fan Xian would make after learning of this matter. "Aunt Ning is a bit strange today," Lin Wan said with a slight furrow of her brows as she looked at the indifferent Pin Ning in the distant corridor. King Jing's expression changed slightly, but he didn't say anything. There were many things that only the previous generation of the Li royal family knew. There was no need to tell these juniors and outsiders. He believed that Lady Ning had true affection for the emperor these years, but he also believed that, up until now, Lady Ning had not forgotten that old cripple. The sun gradually set in the west. It was already dusk. There had been rain in the morning, and there were still some water stains left on the stone tiles. The light gradually dimmed, but the water stains lit up like a lamp had been lit. The lights in the royal palace lit up. Although they could not compare to the dazzling beauty of the red clouds in the western sky, they were still particularly beautiful. The lights in the emperor's sleeping quarters were lit the earliest and had the most lamps. They were incomparably bright, shining through the window and illuminating the surroundings clearly. One could see even the finest hair. Lin Wan's heart trembled slightly. She thought of a few years ago when Fan Xian had been seriously injured and almost lost his life. It seemed that he had also been treated in this palace. At that time, the lights had also been as bright as today. The main surgeon had also been the girl inside. A drop of sweat almost dripped down from the strand of wet hair on her forehead. Fortunately, a serving girl at the side stretched out a handkerchief to catch it. The serving girl retreated with unusual fear, but Fan Ruoruo's expression did not change. She continued to gently move the sharp surgical knife in her hand under the bright light of the room. This entire chest of surgical instruments was made by the palace treasury using the most advanced craftsmanship. It was the condensation of the wisdom of Yi Qingmei, Fei Jia, and later, Fan Xian and everyone else. Fan Ruoruo had also learned how to use these things from her relatives. Her years of bitter cultivation on Qing Mountain and her research into treating external injuries had finally made Fan Ruoruo a true good doctor and not the innocent little girl who had shakily pulled open a bloody wound on her brother's body. The bare-chested emperor lay flat on the hard couch with his eyes slightly closed. Fan Ruoruo was on his right-hand side. She carefully and steadily slid the small knife across his body. Where the knife pointed, the smooth skin split open. The charred hole opened up, and blood seeped out. Fan Ruoruo used her steady hands to reach in with forceps. She clamped down on a hard object and pulled it out forcefully. With a clang, a poisoned steel ball was placed on a flat plate to the side. There were already 7 steel balls on the plate. Up to this point in the operation, half the time had already passed. Fan Ruoruo took a deep breath and slowly activated the Tianyi Dao Xinqi technique that had just begun to appear in her body to help her calm down. Then, she looked at the emperor lying on the bed and said, "There are still a few pills that are very deep. It might be very painful in a moment. Does your majesty need to use some chloroform?" Chloroform was the most successful drug Fan Xian and the Third Bureau had made. It was indeed effective when used in surgery. However, Fan Ruoruo's words revealed a shocking truth. Had the emperor not used anesthetics from the start of the operation and allowed the sharp knife to cut into his body? Fan Ruoruo had used a lot of strength when she used the forceps to remove the steel ball earlier. However, the emperor lying flat on the couch did not even furrow his brows. It was as if he could not feel the pain in his body at all. The Qing emperor slowly opened his eyes and glanced at Fan Ruoruo. "Continue." His tone was indifferent. It was as if the body being cut open by the knife was not his, as if the life-eating steel balls were not deeply embedded in his bones. Fan Ruoruo nodded slightly. She held the sharp knife tightly and loosely. Lowering her head, she continued her work seriously. Her movements were natural as if there was not a glimmer of fear. Since the emperor had spoken, she was no longer worried that the emperor would not be able to endure the pain. It was as if under her knife, there was only a wooden man and not a powerful emperor who could kill millions with the flip of his hand. Looking at Fan Ruoruo's calm expression, the heavily injured emperor narrowed his eyes slightly. He seemed to feel a glimmer of surprise. Calmly, he asked, "Didn't Ji teach you all of this?" Fan Ruoruo focused on the knife and completely ignored the emperor's question. The deeper meaning in the Qing emperor's eyes grew stronger and stronger. "You don't seem to be afraid of me?" Fan Ruoruo took out another steel ball and dealt with the remaining iron sand around the wound. Only then did she quietly say, "Your Majesty is a patient. Ruoruo is just worried that you will not be able to endure this kind of pain and will interfere with the treatment. Don't worry, there were many fierce generals on the battlefield who scraped bones to remove poison." The emperor's gaze dimmed slightly. Slowly, he said, "In my life, the pain I have experienced is much more intense than this." These words referred to the first northern expedition when the meridians in the Qing emperor's body had all been shattered. He had experienced pain and suffering that no human could endure. Fan Ruoruo did not know about this. She was deep in thought and did not reply. The emperor slowly closed his eyes and indifferently said, "This knife is on my body. Tomorrow, it will be returned tenfold to that eunuch's body." After these words were said, the tip of the knife in Fan Ruoruo's hand did not tremble, but her body froze slightly. The emperor looked at her calmly and said, "Don't think about pleading for mercy for that eunuch later. It is a great crime for you to have such thoughts. King Jing, that useless piece of trash, Yi Gui Pin, Lady Ning, Hu Shu, Yi Zhong's daughter accepts Fan Xian as teacher, Gong Dian has always admired that boy, and Yi Chen is also here. The emperor's expression was calm as he looked at her with slightly narrowed eyes. You are his sister. I am very curious. When did everyone around me become related to that boy? That was bestowed upon him by the emperor. Fan Ruoruo finally stopped the surgical knife in her hand and looked calmly at the emperor as the matter involved Fan Xian. I know what you people are thinking and worried about. Blood seeped out from the emperor's naked upper body. However, this great grandmaster emperor did not seem to worry at all about his life slipping away. I greatly despise this kind of worry. He is my own son. Would he rebel against me for a servant? The red candle flickered slightly, but the palace lantern remained bright. Fan Ruoruo gently shook her head and continued to cut and tear at something on this emperor's body. The emperor was only trying to convince himself that loneliness was a terrifying thing, particularly when he discovered that the people around him were more willing to be close to Fan Xian. This made him very uncomfortable. His hatred toward Chen Pingping was mostly because he was under the man's control. He suddenly realized that after all these years, he was still not as good as that woman. In order to prove this point, he hoped that Fan Xian, whom he trusted and doted on the most, could always stand by his side. What kind of emotion was this? Was it probably a need for self-recognition and self-proof? These words should have been the Qing Emperor's inner monologue in the book, but I believe that such a man would, at most, be subconsciously influenced a little. He would not allow such weak emotions to form a concrete picture in his mind, so it would not appear. I also did not want to write this as something omniscient and omnipotent, so I explained a little. Today, it is another 9,000 words. The main theme is reaction and signs. From tomorrow onwards, I will probably have to write 4 or 5 chapters in a row. It will be a serious show in the autumn rain, but I am already tired. Tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday, I will write less because I have a great deal of distrust in my own abilities, so I have to be more serious and properly continue this story. In the end, I will sincerely call for monthly support from everyone. Although it is an old phrase and has no new ideas, it has an attitude. If I write less, it will still be called. I know I am serious, and everyone can see my seriousness. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.